Level it. I don't care who's still on it. Level the bridge now. General Volkov's voice cut through the radio like a blade. His artillery commander hesitated for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of silence that felt like a confession. Because everyone in that command vehicle knew what was on that bridge. Not soldiers, not equipment, families, children. An old woman in a wheelchair, 67 people who had nowhere else to go. And the most powerful man in that valley had just decided none of that mattered. He needed the corridor. He needed it tonight. Everything else was acceptable loss. Everything else could be erased before sunrise. Everything else except one person he didn't know was watching. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The radio crackled at 11:47 in the evening, and the voice on the other end was not calm. It was not measured. It was not the kind of voice you heard from a man who believed everything was going to be fine. It was the voice of a man who had just looked at a map, looked at a clock, and realized that the numbers did not add up in anyone's favor. Hayes, are you reading me? We have a problem. Colonel Nathan Hayes pressed the radio to his ear with both hands, the way a man holds something when he's afraid the signal might disappear before the sentence is finished. He was standing inside what used to be a ranger station, a squat concrete building at the edge of a Montana mountain pass that smelled like old wood diesel fuel and the particular kind of cold that gets inside your bones and stays there. 3 lanterns hung from the ceiling. Maps covered every flat surface. 6 of his staff officers were crowded into a space meant for 2. Talk to me, Hayes said. The eastern corridor is gone. Mudslide took out the secondary route 40 minutes ago. We've got 63 civilians' families. Hayes, we're talking elderly people, children, 2 women who are pregnant, still on the wrong side of the valley. The only way out is Jefferson Bridge. Hayes closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. 1 second was all he allowed himself. And the bridge? A pause on the other end that lasted long enough to feel like an answer all by itself. Artillery hit it twice in the last hour. Engineers are saying it's compromised. They don't know if it'll hold another heavy vehicle crossing. They don't know if it'll hold at all by morning. And the division? Leading elements are 22 minutes out. Maybe less if they push speed. General Volkov has been broadcasting open channel. He's not stopping for anything. He made that very clear about 90 minutes ago when he ordered his forward artillery to shell a medical convoy that was trying to move parallel to his advance. Hayes, he shelled a medical convoy, Red Cross markings and everything. 4 people didn't make it. Hayes opened his eyes. He looked at the map on the table in front of him without really seeing it. 22 minutes, he said quietly, almost to himself, and 63 people. The evacuation teams are moving as fast as they can, but the storm is getting worse. Visibility is down to almost nothing out there. The bridge is the only way. If Volkov gets to that bridge before our people are across, he'll use it, Hayes said. He won't destroy it. He needs it intact to push his armor through the corridor. Unless someone gives him a reason to believe the bridge is already lost. That was Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell speaking now. He was 26 years old and he had been in the room for the past 3 hours trying to make himself useful by keeping the coffee hot and the communications organized. He was not a combat veteran. He had trained for combat, had studied, it had run simulations and read after-action reports until the words blurred together at 2 in the morning. But he had never actually been in a room where the decisions made in the next 5 minutes would determine whether dozens of people lived or died before sunrise. Well, he was in that room now. Hayes looked at him. Say that again, Hayes said. Mitchell pointed at the map. His hand was steady. He was surprised by that. If something happened at the bridge that made Volkov believe it was already collapsing, if something made his advance hesitate, even 30 minutes of confusion could be enough time for the evacuation to complete. Something, Hayes repeated. Or someone, Mitchell said. Someone at the bridge. Someone who could make one armored division think twice about committing to a crossing. The room was quiet for a moment. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room is thinking the same thing and nobody wants to be the first one to say it out loud. Hayes turned away from the map. He walked to the window. Outside, the storm had turned the world into a wall of white and gray and black. The wind was hitting the glass hard enough that the panes rattled slightly in their frames. Somewhere out there, past the tree line, past the frozen river, past the failing steel structure that a few dozen innocent people were depending on a column of armor, was moving through the dark. "Is she out there?" Hayes asked. Nobody answered right away. Then one of his staff officers, a woman named Captain Delaney, who had been working communications for the past 6 hours without a break, cleared her throat. "We received a signal about 40 minutes ago. Short burst encrypted. Source location was consistent with the eastern ridgeline above the bridge." "Was it confirmed?" "We don't confirm her signals, sir. She doesn't allow it. The protocol is one way." Mitchell looked between Hayes and Delaney. "Who are we talking about?" Neither of them answered him immediately, which was in its own way an answer. Mitchell had heard things. Everyone who had been in this theater of operations for more than a week had heard things. Stories that got passed around in the particular way that soldiers pass stories quietly at the edges of conversations in the spaces between official briefings where the truth sometimes leaked through. A name attached to a call sign attached to a history that nobody seemed to know in full. Pieces of a person assembled from rumors and fragments and the memories of soldiers who had seen something in a firefight that they couldn't quite explain afterward. "Midnight watch," Mitchell said. It wasn't a question. Hayes turned from the window. He looked at Mitchell the way a teacher looks at a student who has just said something correct but not yet understood. "Her name is Captain Emily Carter," Hayes said. "Former Army Special Operations, sniper and reconnaissance specialist. She left active service 4 years ago under circumstances that are classified at a level I don't have access to, which tells you something. I've worked with her twice. Once in a situation I am not allowed to discuss, and once in a situation that officially never happened. Both times, she appeared when the tactical picture had already gone past the point where conventional solutions were working." "She just shows up," Mitchell said. "She monitors," Delaney said from across the room. "We don't know exactly how. We don't know everything she watches or everything she tracks. What we know is that when something reaches a certain threshold, when the math gets bad enough, she positions herself. She was on that ridge before we even knew the secondary route was gone." Mitchell processed this. "So she already knows what's happening." "She always knows what's happening," Hayes said. "That's the thing about her that takes a long time to understand. She's not reacting to the situation. She's already 3 steps ahead of it. Then why aren't we coordinating with her if she's already out there?" "Because she doesn't coordinate," Hayes said. His voice wasn't impatient. It was just matter of fact the way a man states a physical law of the universe. "She works alone. She has her own read of the situation. She makes her own decisions. Our job right now is to get those 63 people across that bridge as fast as humanly possible, because whatever she's doing out there, she's doing it to buy us time. And I will not waste a single second of whatever time she gives us." He turned back to the room. "Get the evacuation teams on the radio. I want updates every 90 seconds. I want to know the moment the last person steps off that bridge. Move." The room came alive. Mitchell stood at the edge of it, watching Hayes work, watching Delaney manage 4 simultaneous radio frequencies, watching the staff officers pin updated information to the maps and run calculations he didn't fully follow. He felt the strange dual sensation of being completely in the middle of something and completely outside of it at the same time. He picked up his own radio handset. He turned it over in his hands. He thought about the bridge. "I thought about 63 people walking across a structure that engineers had already declared compromised. He thought about a woman somewhere in the dark, in the snow, in the wind alone, with a rifle and whatever she carried in her head when the world closed in. What does she actually do out there?" he asked, not to anyone in particular, more to the room. Delaney answered without looking up from her equipment, "Whatever she has to." Outside the station, the storm grew louder, and 22 miles away on a ridge above the frozen river, Emily Carter lay completely still in the snow and watched the first headlights appear in the valley below. She had been in position for 2 hours. That was not unusual for her. She had been in position for much longer than 2 hours on nights that were much colder than this one, in places where the stakes were entirely different and in places where they were very much the same. Patience was not something Emily had learned in the Army. She had arrived in the Army already knowing how to be still, how to breathe slow, how to let the part of her brain that wanted to move and react and do something settle down into a quieter register where the real thinking happened. She had learned that in a childhood that most people hearing about it would describe as difficult. She preferred the word formative. The scope of her rifle was fogged slightly at the edges from the cold. She had accounted for that. She had accounted for the wind drift, which was running at about 12 miles per hour from the northwest and would push any shot she fired approximately 4 inches right at 800 meters. She had accounted for the temperature, which was dropping, which affected the powder burn in the cartridge in ways that most shooters learned in theory, and she had learned by necessity. She had accounted for the elevation change between her position and the bridge deck for the angle of the steel beams that would give her partial cover for the 3 positions she had already identified as good fallback options if her current location was compromised. She had not accounted for the way the bridge sounded when the wind hit it. That was new. The old Jefferson Bridge had always made noise. Every steel structure does. Thermal expansion, the movement of traffic, wind loading, they all produce sounds that a bridge absorbs into its structural language. Emily had studied the bridge from aerial imagery, from engineering records she had obtained through channels she preferred not to specify, from 2 hours of direct observation before the storm intensified. She knew what the bridge was supposed to sound like. What she was hearing now was different. It was a lower sound, deeper in the steel, the sound of something that was no longer entirely sure of itself. She pressed the radio button once. A single click, a signal that told Hayes she was in a position, and then released it and said nothing. Protocol. She never transmitted voice unless the situation had passed the point where silence was still an option. She watched the headlights. They were moving in column formation, disciplined spacing. The lead vehicles were lighter reconnaissance and command elements, pushing ahead of the main armor mass. Behind them, she could see the broader, slower shapes of the heavy track vehicles, their running lights dim in the falling snow, their engine noise beginning to reach her as a low vibration that she felt in her chest more than she heard. 22 minutes, the radio traffic had said. She had been listening. She didn't know Hayes was in that ranger station. She knew someone was there. She had identified the building 40 minutes ago by the pattern of radio emissions. She knew someone was coordinating the evacuation. She knew the eastern route was gone because she had seen the mudslide from the ridgeline before anyone at the command post had received the news. She knew 63 people were on that bridge or approaching it. She had counted them herself. She had a different number than Hayes did. She had 67. She had seen 4 people that the official count had missed: an elderly man who had fallen and been helped back up by a younger woman, and 2 children who had briefly separated from their group before being recovered. The count in the official reports was never quite right. That was something Emily had come to accept as a feature of the way organizations processed information under stress. The human beings on the ground saw things that the reports never captured. She saw things. That was, in the end, the most fundamental thing about her that no amount of official documentation could adequately convey. Emily Carter saw things. Not in any mystical sense. She had no patience for mystical explanations of anything. She saw things because she had trained herself to look, and because she had been looking for so long and in so many different kinds of situations that seeing had become involuntary, automatic, as natural as breathing. She saw the bridge. She saw the fracture patterns in 2 of the main support beams. She had identified these earlier in the brief window between artillery strikes when the dust cleared enough to use the scope. The eastern primary support was cracked through about 40% of its cross-section. That was the bad one. The western cable anchor had shifted during the second strike, visible as a slight cant in the deck at the western approach. A heavy vehicle, a main battle tank, which ran upward of 60 tons, would accelerate the structural failure significantly. Might be enough to initiate a collapse on its own. She needed to make sure no heavy vehicle got to that bridge while 67 people were still on it. The first mini convoy of armored vehicles crested the valley road below and began picking up speed. Emily began her real work. She was not going to shoot soldiers. That was a decision she had made before she got into position, and it was a decision that came from the same place. All her real decisions came from the precise, honest calculation of what was necessary and nothing beyond it. Shooting soldiers would produce a reaction. It would produce a focused, organized, rapid response from a force that had the numbers and equipment to neutralize a single shooter in a matter of minutes. It would alert them to the nature of the threat and allow them to adapt to it. She was not going to fight them. She was going to confuse them. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. Confusion requires different tools. It requires an understanding of how an organization thinks, how it communicates, how it makes decisions under pressure. An armored division is an enormously powerful machine, but like any machine, it has components, and if the right components stop functioning correctly, the machine cannot perform the function it was built for. Command vehicles communicate. Take out the communications array on a command vehicle, not the vehicle itself, not the crew, and you created a gap in the information flow that the organization has to work to close. That closing process takes time. It takes the attention of people who would otherwise be focused on moving forward. Navigation equipment fails in storms. The failure does not have to be genuine. The failure only has to be believed. Predictive behavior. Emily had read everything available about General Volkov, his career history, his after-action reports from 3 previous engagements, the documented patterns in how he allocated forces, and how he responded when an advance encountered unexpected friction. There is a specific decision-making rhythm to every commander, and Volkov's rhythm had a particular feature when he encountered friction on his primary axis of advance. He responded by pushing harder on that axis before considering a course correction. He was in the language of military assessment, an accelerator rather than a pauser. Emily planned to give him friction, carefully selected friction that looked from inside his decision cycle like a problem that could be overcome by pushing harder. Because every time Volkov pushed harder in the wrong direction, he was giving Emily 67 people another 30 seconds. She exhaled. She made her first shot. It was not aimed at anyone. It hit the primary communications mast on the lead command vehicle, a thin steel post about 14 millimeters in diameter, at a distance of 840 meters in a 25-kilometer-per-hour crosswind, in near-zero visibility and temperatures that were actively affecting her equipment's performance. It was a shot that most qualified military snipers would have called impossible. Emily didn't think about it in those terms. She thought of it as a calculation that had a correct answer and a mechanism for delivering that answer, and she had done the calculation, and she had the mechanism, and so she executed. The mast sheared at the base. The lead command vehicle's primary radio system went to backup. Backup systems were slower. Slower systems meant a delay in Volkov receiving reports from his forward elements. Delay meant confusion. Confusion meant hesitation. And hesitation, even 30 seconds of it was time. On the bridge, 67 people kept moving. An elderly woman named Dorothy had been walking for 40 minutes. She was 74 years old and she had arthritis in both knees, and she had not told the evacuation team this because she did not want to slow anyone down. The young soldier who was helping her, a private first class named Torres, who was 20 years old and had been assigned to evacuation assistance because his unit was under strength, had been quietly matching her pace for the last 20 minutes without saying anything about it. "Are we close?" Dorothy asked. Torres checked the bridge ahead of them. The far end was visible through the snow. Not close, but visible. "Getting there," he said. "My husband crossed this bridge every day for 11 years, Dorothy said. "He worked at the mill on the other side. He said the bridge talked to him in the mornings. Said every bridge has its own voice." The bridge groaned beneath them, low and metallic and unmistakably a sound of stress. Torres kept his hand firmly on Dorothy's arm and kept walking. "What's your husband say about this one?" he said. Dorothy listened to the bridge for a moment. "He says hurry," she said. Back at the command post, Mitchell was tracking the evacuation updates. He had commandeered a corner of the ranger station and set up a simple tally system on a piece of paper, each update from the evacuation teams represented by a mark, each confirmed crossing represented by a circle around that mark. It was low-tech and redundant, and Hayes had looked at it once and said nothing, which Mitchell had taken as approval. 41 confirmed crossings, 26 remaining. "We're getting there," he told Delaney. She didn't look up. "The armored column has slowed," she said, reading from a feed that Mitchell didn't have access to. "Reconnaissance elements have halted at the Valley Road junction. Reason unclear." Mitchell looked at the ceiling. He thought about a woman in the snow with a rifle. "The reason isn't unclear," he said quietly. Delaney glanced at him. "She's in their head," he said. "She's already in their head." "Is." In the valley below the ridge, the situation in Volkov's forward element had shifted from mild disruption to active confusion. The communications mast problem had been reported back through backup channels slower, as Emily had intended, and the report that eventually reached Volkov's command vehicle described a malfunction of uncertain origin. Equipment failure in severe weather conditions was not unprecedented. Volkov was not alarmed by a malfunctioning radio mast. But then the forward reconnaissance team reported something else. They had been advancing toward the bridge when they detected what their equipment described as an active firing position approximately 800 meters to the northeast. One position, Volkov asked. That is the current assessment general. He looked at his operations officer. The operations officer looked at the map. Then they both looked at each other with the specific expression that two experienced soldiers share when something does not match the intelligence picture they were given. One position, Volkov said again, in this weather, at this range. General, the forward element is requesting permission to engage. Volkov did not answer immediately. He was thinking. This was in Emily's analysis the most important moment. Volkov was a man who trusted his instincts when his instincts were fed by sufficient information. Right now, his information was incomplete. The communications mast was down. His reconnaissance picture had a gap in it. He was being asked to commit to an engagement at a position that had been detected in conditions where detection was nearly impossible. A position that seemed to be exactly where someone wanted it to be found. Volkov picked up his own radio. Do not engage, he said. Hold position. I want aerial reconnaissance on that ridgeline. His operations officer blinked. General, we have limited aerial assets in this weather. Then find me what we have. I want eyes on that ridge before I commit any element forward. The column stopped. Emily saw it from 800 meters away. She allowed herself a small nod. He had taken the bait. Not the way she had hoped he would push forward, because forward motion against a single prepared position in this terrain was something she could manage. His decision to stop and reassess was in a tactical sense smarter. But smarter decisions take longer. Volkov had just given himself a problem that would require 15 minutes at minimum to resolve, and 15 minutes was what she needed. She began repositioning. Moving in the snow was slow. Every movement had to account for the visibility, not just her ability to see, but the ability of anyone on the valley floor to see her against the white and gray background. She moved in the gaps between wind gusts, each movement planned 3 steps ahead, each stop held until she was certain the position was clear. She had already prepared 4 fallback positions. She moved to the second one now. Below her on the bridge, Dorothy and Torres reached the far end of the span. Torres got on his radio immediately. 2 confirmed across. How many remaining? 14, the evacuation coordinator answered. Keep moving. We're sending transport to your position. Dorothy stopped walking when she reached solid ground on the far side. She turned around. She looked at the bridge. She looked at the snow falling across the valley. She could not see anything except white and darkness. But somewhere in that white and darkness, she understood something was happening. Something that was keeping the bridge alive long enough for the people still on it. God keep her, Dorothy said, not loudly, not dramatically, the way people say things when they mean them completely. Torres looked at her. Who? Dorothy looked at him. Her eyes were clear and direct in the way that very old people's eyes sometimes are when they have spent enough time seeing things to know what is real and what is not. Whoever is out there, Dorothy said, in this weather, alone. She turned back toward the shelter where the transport was waiting. Someone is. You know that, don't you? Torres looked back at the bridge. The wind hit the structure, and it made that deep, low sound again. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I know that. At the command post, the evacuation tally now read 53-14 remaining. At the operations center of Volkov's command vehicle, the aerial reconnaissance request had hit a wall. The weather had grounded all rotary assets. Fixed-wing surveillance was theoretically possible, but the storm cell had pushed east faster than it predicted, and the window for safe overflight was closing rapidly. Volkov's intelligence officer had just finished telling him that confirmation of the ridgeline position would take at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes. The word hung in the command vehicle like smoke. Volkov's operations officer, a colonel named Marchetti, who had served with Volkov for 9 years and knew exactly when to push back and when to be quiet, was quiet. The communications officer, a young lieutenant on his first field deployment, was also quiet. Volkov studied the map. The bridge is still standing, he said. Yes, General. And we have a single confirmed firing position on the ridgeline. That is the current Not a defensive line, not multiple positions. One. One confirmed general. Potentially more that are undetected. Potentially, Volkov repeated. The word tasted like something he didn't like. He had built his entire career on reducing uncertainty. Potential was the enemy of certainty. Send the counter-sniper team. Marchetti looked up. General, one sniper. We respond with our counter-sniper team. They locate and neutralize the position, and we advance. We have wasted enough time. He straightened up. This is a delay tactic. It is working because we are allowing it to work. The bridge is the objective. We move. And the aerial assessment, cancel it. Move. The column lurched back into motion. Emily heard it before she saw it. The vibration in the ground reached her position, not much but enough. She had been in this kind of snow enough times to know what the vibration from tracked vehicle movement felt like at different distances. They were moving again, and they had picked up speed. She looked through the scope at the valley. The column was reorganizing. The lead elements were pushing faster now. She estimated 8 minutes to the bridge approach. And she could see at the far left edge of her field of view a different kind of movement. Two vehicles had separated from the main column. They were not heading toward the bridge. They were heading toward the ridgeline. Emily did not feel fear in any dramatic Hollywood way. She did not have a cold sweat or a trembling hand. What she felt was the specific clarifying sensation of understanding a situation very clearly and knowing exactly how much time she had and what she needed to do with it. The counter-sniper team. She had expected them. She had built them into her timeline. But she had expected them later. Volkov had made the call earlier than her model predicted. She adjusted. She pressed the radio button. 2 clicks. The prearranged signal that meant she was repositioning and the timeline had compressed. At the command post, Delaney saw the signal register. She did not tell Mitchell what 2 clicks meant. She told Hayes. Hayes stood at the map for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked at Delaney. Tell the evacuation teams that they have 8 minutes, he said. They need to move like their lives depend on it. He paused. Because they do. Mitchell was already on his radio. All evacuation teams, priority movement. 8 minutes. Do not wait for stragglers. Do not stop for equipment. You carry people if you have to. Move. Move now. On the bridge, the 14 remaining civilians heard the urgency in the voices coming through the evacuation coordinator's radio. Soldiers began moving faster. Families were physically guided, hands on shoulders, quick footsteps on the groaning steel deck. A child 8 years old, wearing a red jacket that was too big for him, lost one of his boots in a gap in the bridge deck where the surface had buckled. He stopped. His mother reached for him. A soldier scooped him up before either of them could decide what to do next and kept walking without breaking stride. I lost my boot, the child said. I know, the soldier said. We'll get you a new one. It was my good boot. You'll have 2 good boots before morning. I promise. Keep your head down. The bridge made a sound like a deep breath being released, long and slow and terminal. And Emily Carter heard it from 800 meters away, and she understood exactly what it meant. And she looked at the approaching headlights of Volkov's column and then looked at the bridge where the last 14 people were walking, and she made the decision that she had been building toward from the moment she took her first position. She was going to have to be visible, not visible like a target, visible like a problem that could not be ignored. It was a different calculation. It was a riskier one. And she was already moving toward it before she had finished making it, because that was the thing about Emily Carter, that no official record and no rumor and no legend quite captured correctly. She didn't wait. She had never waited. She had always already been moving toward the hardest version of whatever was coming. She had just been doing it quietly enough that nobody noticed until it was done. The storm swallowed her shadow. The bridge held. For now. And on the far bank, an elderly woman named Dorothy stood in the shelter of a transport vehicle and watched the bridge through the falling snow and said nothing and prayed in the particular way of someone who has lived long enough to know exactly what they are asking for and exactly how much it costs. The 8 minutes were already running. And in the dark, somewhere between the ridge and the valley and the failing bridge and the advancing armor, Captain Emily Carter was doing what she had always done. She was refusing to let the math win. 8 minutes, that's what Hayes had said. 8 minutes to get 14 people across a bridge that was already dying underneath their feet while an armored column pushed hard through the valley below, and a counter-sniper team climbed the ridgeline looking for one woman in the snow. Mitchell stood at the communications table with the radio in his hand and watched the tally on his paper and tried to breathe normally. 53 across, 14 remaining, 8 minutes. He said the numbers out loud to himself like a man checking his math on something that had to be right. 53, 14, 8. He pressed the radio key. Evacuation lead, this is command. What is your current position on the bridge? The answer came back broken by static and wind noise. We have 11 on the bridge, 3 approaching from the eastern staging area. Oldest of the 3 is in a wheelchair. We're working on it. Mitchell looked at Hayes. Hayes was already across the room, pulling on his coat. Sir, Mitchell started. Someone has to go get that wheelchair, Hayes said. He didn't look up. He was pulling gloves on with the focused efficiency of a man who had made a decision and was not inviting debate. Delaney, you have command of this post. Keep the evacuation teams coordinated. The moment everyone is across, you radio me. Not in 30 seconds, not when it's convenient. The moment it happens. Colonel, the protocol was written by people who weren't standing in this building watching an elderly person in a wheelchair trying to cross a collapsing bridge in a blizzard. He looked at her directly. Radio me. Delaney met his eyes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hayes went out the door into the storm without another word. Mitchell watched the door swing shut. He stood there for approximately 2 seconds, and then he did something that no one in that room had authorized, and that he had not planned, and that he would spend the next several years trying to explain, and never quite being satisfied with any of the explanations he came up with. He followed Hayes out the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, not the polite kind of cold that a heating system eventually negotiates with. This was cold with intent. It went straight through his coat and his uniform underneath and found every place where his body was generating heat and began dismantling those places one by one. The wind was coming across the pass at an angle that made walking in a straight line something that required deliberate effort. He caught up with Hayes at the edge of the tree line. Hayes glanced at him without breaking stride. I didn't order you to come. No, sir. You understand what's out there? Yes, sir. Hayes looked at him for one more second. Then he looked ahead. Keep up. They moved through the trees toward the bridge approach. On the ridge above the valley, Emily had already moved to her third prepared position. She was moving faster than she preferred to move, which meant she was leaving more trace than she preferred to leave. Compressed footprints in the snow, a slight compression in a snowbank where she had used it for cover for 11 seconds before deciding the sightlines were wrong. A dislodged piece of ice on a steel beam that had fallen 12 feet and landed with a sound that was probably lost in the wind, but probably was not something she should have allowed. The counter-sniper team was good. She had known they would be good. Volkov's unit had a reputation, and the reputation had specifics attached to it that Emily had reviewed before she took this assignment. Two-man team, both decorated, both with confirmed long-range engagements in their records. The spotter had a background in terrain analysis that was frankly impressive. The shooter had a documented patience that under different circumstances, Emily might have respected without qualification. Under these circumstances, she respected it carefully. They were below her on the ridgeline, moving up, using the slope itself as cover, which was smart. They had not fired yet, which was smarter. A team that fires before it is certain of its target is a team that reveals its position. These two were not making that mistake. Emily had exactly one advantage over them that mattered. She had been on this ridge for 2 hours before they arrived. She knew it the way you know a room you have been sitting in for a long time in the dark. The specific places where the snow was packed hard enough to support weight silently, and the places where it was loose enough to crunch. The angle of the beams on the bridge below that provided interference patterns in any thermal or optical scope. The wind channeling between two rock formations to the east that created a consistent background noise level, masking small movement sounds. She moved through all of it without hesitation, but she could not move and maintain observation of the bridge approach simultaneously. That was the problem she had not fully solved. She pressed the radio button twice, then once, then twice again. At the command post, Delaney translated the signal pattern automatically and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She picked up the internal line to the evacuation coordinator. How many still on this bridge? 9. We had a problem at the eastern end. Wheelchair. Hayes went to Xiao. I know where Hayes went. Delaney cut her off. 9 on the bridge. What's the pace? Slow. Storm is getting worse. The surface is icing. Get them off that bridge. I don't care how. Ma'am, I don't care how, Delaney repeated. Her voice was flat and precise and left no room for the word but. Get them off. She put down the internal line and looked at the signal indicator and thought about what Emily's pattern had meant. A counter-sniper team in contact range. Timeline compressing faster than originally communicated. She pulled up the Valley Road feed on the secondary monitor and looked at the column's progress and did the math in her head, and the math was not good. She had been in rooms where the math was not good before. She picked up the next radio. All artillery assets. This is forward command. I need a targeting solution on the Valley Road junction at coordinate. She checked the map. Bravo 74. Do not fire. I say again, do not fire. Targeting solution only standing by for authorization. The artillery officer on the other end of that radio said, ma'am, if we shell that junction, the road will become impassable. Yes, I know. That is why I said targeting solution only. I am not authorizing the shot. I am asking you to be ready to take it the moment I authorize it. There is a difference. Are you ready? A pause. Standing by, ma'am. Delaney looked at the tally, 9 remaining. She thought about what Emily's signal had really meant underneath the technical translation. It had meant, I am running out of room. And Delaney, who had worked with Hayes long enough to understand the specific gravity of that kind of message from that particular person, did not let herself think about what it meant for Emily. She only thought about the 9 people on the bridge and the shot she was not yet authorized to take, and the minutes running down like water through cracked fingers. On the bridge, a man named Carl, who was 68 years old and had been a high school football coach for 31 years, was carrying a 7-year-old girl on his back because her mother's ankle had given out on the icy surface and someone had to carry the child. Carl had a heart condition that his doctor had told him about 8 months ago and that he had told approximately no one else about. His chest was doing something complicated that he was choosing not to pay attention to. The girl's name was Maya. She had her arms around his neck, and she wasn't crying, and she wasn't talking, and Carl thought that was either very brave or very frightening, and he didn't have the bandwidth to figure out which. You doing okay up there? He asked her. Your breathing sounds funny, she said. Cold air, he said. Does that to you? My dad says cold air is good for you. Your dad's a smart man. Where is he? He's at the front, she said. He crossed already, and he's waiting for us. Carl kept walking. The bridge deck shifted slightly under his left foot. Not a dramatic shift, not a fall, just a millimeter of give, where there should have been no give at all. And he adjusted his weight without thinking about it, the way a man who played football for 40 years adjusts his weight automatically from the feet up. We're almost there, he said. He didn't actually know if they were almost there. He said it because it was the thing you say. Behind him, Torres, the same young private who had helped Dorothy across, was supporting Maya's mother on his right side, his arm around her waist, her arm over his shoulders, moving in the awkward, synchronized shuffle of 2 people who have just met and are already depending on each other completely. How bad is the ankle? Torres asked. Bad enough, she said. Her name was Patricia. She was 34 years old and she had carried Maya on her own back for the first 10 minutes of the bridge crossing before the ankle went, and she had said nothing about the ankle for the next 5 minutes after that, before Torres noticed she was limping badly enough that she was going to fall. Can you feel your foot? Parts of it. That's fine, that's enough. We just need to keep moving. Is the bridge? She stopped the sentence. Torres knew what she was going to ask. Keep moving, he said. Don't listen to it, just move. The bridge made the sound again, not a creak, not a groan. The sound was deeper than that. It was the sound of something large and old and fundamentally stressed, finding a new way to distribute a load that had become too much. Patricia heard it and her whole body stiffened, and Torres felt it through his arm around her waist. Don't stop, he said immediately. That's actually good. It's settling. Keep moving. It was not good. He knew it was not good, but Patricia kept moving. In the valley below the ridge, the column's lead elements had reached the 500-meter mark from the bridge approach. Volkov was in his command vehicle studying the reports from the counter-sniper team. The team had not yet confirmed a target location. They were still climbing, still searching. His operations officer, Marchetti, was watching the timing with the careful attention of a man who had learned that timing in Volkov's campaigns was the difference between success and a painful conversation afterward. General Marchetti said, "At current pace, we reach the bridge approach in approximately 4 minutes. Counter-sniper team status. Still ascending. No confirmed target." Volkov made a sound that was not quite a word. Marchetti had heard that sound before. It was the sound Volkov made when a variable was not resolving on his preferred schedule. It was not a good sound to be in the room with. "The bridge," Volkov said. "Sir, is there anyone on the bridge?" Marchetti checked the reconnaissance feed. "Thermal imaging is degraded by the storm. We have possibly small signatures. Difficult to confirm." "Possibly," Volkov repeated. The command vehicle was quiet for a moment. Then Volkov said something that surprised even Marchetti. "If there are civilians on that bridge, we hold." Marchetti looked at him. Volkov did not look back. He was looking at the feed on his own monitor. "We hold. We do not advance to the bridge while there are civilians on it. That is my order and it does not change." He paused. "But the moment the bridge is clear, I want the column moving, full speed." "Understood." "Understood, General." Marchetti turned away and gave the order. He did not say what he was thinking. What he was thinking was that Volkov had just drawn a line, and that line had a very specific shape, and that somewhere in the dark above the valley, someone had predicted that line and built it into a plan. He did not know who. He was beginning to understand that it mattered. On the ridge, Emily heard the column slow. She had not expected that. She processed it in about 2 seconds. Volkov had stopped short of the bridge, thermal imaging. He had seen something on the bridge and made a decision that was, and this was the part that required the 2 seconds, the decision of a man who had a line he would not cross. He would not advance while civilians were present. That was not what the intelligence profile on Volkov had suggested. The intelligence profile had described the man who shelled the medical convoy. Emily looked at the bridge. She looked at the thermal feed through her scope, not the same as Volkov's system, but capable enough in the direction that mattered. 8 people still crossing. She looked back at the column. She looked at the counter-sniper team's likely position based on their last detectable movement. She did a calculation that had several variables and exactly one acceptable answer. She needed the 8 people to move faster, and she needed to give them the space to do it, which meant she needed to be somewhere other than where she was, which meant she needed the counter-sniper team to be looking somewhere other than her actual position, which meant she needed to make a sound, a specific sound, in a specific place. Emily reached into the pack at her side and removed a small device, not exotic, not classified, the kind of thing a person with her background put together from components that were available at any hardware supply store if you knew what you were looking for. She set the timer. She placed it against a steel beam of the bridge structure at the near end, the end closest to her current position. She moved. Fast now. Not careful fast, committed fast, the kind of movement that accepts the risk of noise because the alternative risk is larger. 40 seconds later, the device activated. It produced, in the context of the storm and the wind and the general acoustic environment of a ridgeline above a frozen river, a sound that was entirely consistent with a suppressed rifle shot. Not perfect. Emily knew it wasn't perfect. She also knew that 2 highly trained soldiers who had been searching this ridge for 20 minutes and had not yet found their target would, when they heard that sound, orient toward it. Because that is what training does. It builds responses that are reliable and rapid and usually correct, and usually is a word that leaves room for the exception. The counter-sniper team oriented toward the sound. Emily was already 90 meters in the opposite direction in her 4th prepared position, lying flat in the snow with her scope on the bridge. 8 people, now 7. She watched Carl reach the far end of the bridge with Maya still on his back. Maya's father was there. Emily saw him through the scope, a man who had been waiting on the far bank with the specific physical stillness of someone who has run out of useful things to do and is enduring the wait through sheer concentrated will. The moment he saw Carl, he moved. He crossed the last 20 feet of the bridge approach at something close to a sprint. Carl handed Maya over without slowing down very much because his body understood at this point that stopping was a bad idea. "Thank you," the father said. Carl didn't hear him. He was already focused on the next step and the one after, and the way his chest felt, and the cold, in the bridge behind him, And none of those things were things he was going to think about until he reached somewhere that was not the middle of a situation. 6 remaining. Torres got Patricia to the far bank. She grabbed the railing at the end of the bridge with both hands and held it like she was not entirely sure the ground on the other side was real. Torres kept his arm around her until she released the railing, and then he pointed her toward the shelter area and turned back. "What are you doing?" she said. "5 more people," he said. "You can't go back out." "Patricia." He said her name the way he might have said it if he'd known her for years instead of 12 minutes. "I have to." She looked at him. She let him go. Torres ran back onto the bridge. At the command post, the tally read 62, 5 remaining. Mitchell and Hayes had reached the eastern bridge approach, and Hayes was behind the wheelchair, pushing it across the bridge deck with a focus that blocked out everything except the forward direction and the person in the chair. The person was a woman named Ruth, who was 81 years old and who had lived through enough history that her assessment of the current situation was measured and direct. "You're the colonel," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Hayes said, pushing. "You left your command post to push my chair." "Yes, ma'am." "That seems like a poor use of your resources. I'll include it in the after-action report." Hayes pushed harder. The wheel caught on a buckled section of the deck, and he wrenched it free. "Hold on." "I've been holding on," Ruth said. "I've been holding on for 81 years. I know how it's done." The bridge moved, not a small movement. A significant lateral shift. The kind of movement a structure makes when something fundamental in its load-bearing arrangement has changed. Hayes felt it through his feet and threw his hands on the wheelchair handles, and he made a decision in approximately half a second. He stopped pushing. He picked Ruth up out of the chair. She made a sound of sharp indignation, and he carried her, running, not fast, but running with an 81-year-old woman in his arms, and the bridge moving under his feet, and Mitchell running beside him, and the far end of the span, still 40 meters away. "Young man," Ruth said, "I have opinions about this." "Tell me on the other side," Hayes said. "I will. You can count on that." Mitchell was running alongside them and watching the bridge deck and watching the far end and watching the structural cables on the western side that were vibrating in a way that he did not have the engineering background to fully interpret, but that his body was interpreting without that background viscerally from somewhere below the level of training. "It's going," Mitchell said. "Hayes, it's going." "I know," Hayes said. "Oing." He did not slow down. 30 meters. 20. Torres came sprinting back from the other direction off the bridge and onto the approach with 2 elderly men who had been the last pair of civilians on the span, his arms around both of them, moving at a pace that none of the 3 of them would have chosen individually, but that the situation had chosen for them. They cleared the bridge deck. Hayes cleared the bridge deck with Ruth in his arms. Mitchell was the last one off. He stepped onto solid ground and turned around. The bridge made a sound that was not like any of the earlier sounds. Those sounds had been the language of stress, of load, of something working hard against forces pushing against it. This sound was different. This was the sound of something giving up. Not in defeat, more like in relief. The eastern primaries support the one with the 40% fracture that Emily had identified from the ridge separated from its anchor point. Not all at once. It went in stages, which was in some ways worse than if it had gone instantly, because each stage gave everyone standing on the bank the opportunity to watch it happen and understand what they were watching. The western deck tilted. Steel cables snapped one by one in a sequence that sounded almost deliberate. The middle section of the Jefferson Bridge dropped into the frozen river in 3 separate pieces. The sound of it hit the far bank half a second later, a deep structural boom that rolled up through the valley and bounced off the ridgeline and disappeared into the storm. Everyone stood completely still. Mitchell was still standing at the edge of the approach with snow on his boots and his radio in his hand, and his mind was not keeping up with events at quite the necessary speed. Ruth, still in Hayes' arms, looked at what used to be the bridge. "Put me down, please," she said. Hayes set her down carefully. She smoothed her coat. She looked at the broken span. "My husband proposed to me on that bridge," she said. 1967 in November. It was cold then, too. Nobody said anything. "He died 3 years ago," she said. "He would have found this extremely dramatic." She straightened up. She looked at Hayes. "Did everyone make it?" "Yes, ma'am." "All 63. Mitchell thought of his count, 67, but he didn't say that. "Everyone," Hayes said. Ruth nodded once. "Good," she said. "That's the only part that matters." In the valley below, the column had stopped at the bridge approach. Volkov got out of his command vehicle. He walked to the edge of what used to be the bridgehead and looked at the river and looked at the broken steel in the water and looked at the opposite bank, which was dark and empty and offered nothing useful to his advance. He stood there for a long moment. Marchetti came to stand beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Volkov said, "The counter-sniper team. Still on the ridgeline, no confirmed target, General." Volkov looked at the broken bridge for another few seconds. "Pull them back," he said. Marchetti looked at him. "Pull them back," Volkov repeated. "There is no target. There was never a target, not the kind they were looking for." He turned back toward his command vehicle. "Get me the engineers. I want an alternate crossing point by morning." He did not sound angry. He sounded like a man who had encountered something he had not encountered in a long time and was still processing what to call it. On the ridge, Emily Carter heard the bridge fall. She heard it the way you hear something you have been listening for. Not with surprise, but with a specific kind of recognition. The way you hear a word in a conversation that confirms what you already knew the conversation was about. She was crouched at her fourth position, with her rifle across her knees and the counter-sniper team's last known location marked in her memory, and the cold doing what the cold does, which is everything at once relentlessly. She pressed the radio button. One click. At the command post, Delaney received the signal and looked at it for a moment. One click. Done. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Not because she was relieved exactly. She had been in this job long enough that relief was complicated. It came mixed with things, the awareness of what could have gone differently, the weight of the moments where the margin had been almost nothing. She opened her eyes. "Artillery assets, stand down," she said into the radio. "I say again, stand down. Authorization canceled. Good work." She put the radio down. She picked up the internal line. "Evacuation coordinator confirmed final count." A pause. 67 confirmed across, ma'am." Delaney wrote the number down. Not 63, 67. She stared at the number for a moment and thought about where the extra 4 had come from, and decided that the answer was probably the same as it usually was in these situations. Someone had been paying closer attention than the official count. Someone had been watching from the beginning. She did not circle the number. She underlined it. Then she set the pen down and looked at the window and thought about the ridge and about a woman in the snow who had been the only reason any of this was the number 67 and not something much smaller and much harder to say out loud. On the ridge, Emily was moving, not running. Moving, deliberate, controlled the way she had been moving since she took her first position 2 hours and 40 minutes ago. The counter-sniper team was beginning to descend. She could hear them now below her, their equipment sounds filtering up through the wind. They were professionals, and they were frustrated, and they were going back to their unit with nothing, which is a specific kind of frustration that good soldiers carry in a specific place. She did not feel sorry for them. She did not feel triumphant either. She felt the cold and the weight of the rifle in the beginning of the deep exhaustion that comes not from physical effort alone, but from the particular sustained mental effort of holding an entire situation in your head for hours at a time and making no mistakes. She had a long walk back to the extraction point. She started walking. The storm was still going. It showed no interest in stopping for anyone. Emily had never expected it to. She pulled her coat tighter and kept moving and listened to the wind and let herself, for the first time in hours, think about nothing except the next step and the one after it, in the cold ground under her boots, in the dark sky above the mountains, in the fact that somewhere on the other side of the broken bridge, 67 people were alive and moving toward warmth. That was enough. It was always enough. Behind her, the remains of the Jefferson Bridge sat in the frozen rivers, and the storm covered them slowly with fresh snow, and the valley that Volkov had needed became a valley that he could not use, and the corridor closed and the region held. None of that happened because of an army. It happened because of arithmetic. The arithmetic of one prepared position against one armored division, calculated by someone who understood that the most powerful force in any engagement is not the one with the most equipment. It is the one that understands time. Emily Carter understood time. She had always understood time. She walked through the storm toward the extraction point, and she did not look back because looking back was not useful, and she had no patience for things that were not useful, and the bridge was gone, and the people were safe, and the mission was complete. And in the command post, Delaney put on a fresh pot of coffee and waited for Hayes to come back through the door. And she thought about the underlying number on the page 67. And she thought about how 4 extra people were alive because someone on a ridge had been counting more carefully than anyone else. And she thought that was the thing about Emily Carter that the legends always got wrong. They made her sound like something superhuman, something beyond ordinary reach. What Delaney knew from 2 years of working adjacent to whatever it was Emily did in the dark and the cold, and the impossible mathematics of situations that had gone too far, was that the truth was almost the opposite. Emily Carter was not superhuman. She was just more human than most people allowed themselves to be. She paid attention when paying attention was hard. She stayed when staying cost something. She counted the 4 that everyone else missed, and she made sure those 4 were in the number that got underlined at the end. That was the whole story. That was all of it, except that it wasn't. Because somewhere in the hills above the valley, the counter-sniper team's spotter was sitting on a rock and looking at his scope and looking at the patterns in the snow on the ridge above him, the places where the snow had been disturbed and then the disturbance had been carefully obscured, and he was working backward through the night's events, reconstructing a path, a series of positions, a sequence of decisions. He had been doing this for 6 minutes. He was very good at it. And what he was finding as he worked backward through the evidence in the snow was not the work of one person under pressure making rapid decisions. What he was finding was a plan, prepared positions, pre-calculated firing solutions, a decoy device of elegant simplicity, movement patterns that use terrain the way a chess player uses pieces not reactively, but several moves ahead. He found 4 positions. He sat with that for a long moment. Then he found the 5th and the 6th. He put down the scope. He sat in the snow on the ridgeline in the middle of the storm, and he thought about what it meant that someone had prepared 6 positions on a bridge they had never physically inspected in weather that made reconnaissance nearly impossible against a timetable they could not have known with certainty. He thought about it for a long time. Then he picked up his radio. Spotter to team lead. Go ahead. I've been working the ridge, tracking the positions. And a pause. The spotter looked at the 6th position in the snow, at the perfect geometry of it, at the way it commanded simultaneous sight lines to 3 separate approach routes to the bridge deck and to the position where the counter-sniper team had been when they heard the decoy sound. She knew we were coming, the spotter said. Not when Volkov sent us, not when we started climbing. She planned for us before the column even entered the valley. A long silence on the other end. Then the team lead said, "How is that possible?" The spotter looked at the storm. "I don't know," he said, "but she left us something." "What?" The spotter reached down into the snow beside the 6th position, where a small object was sitting on top of the packed surface as if it had been placed there deliberately, which it had. It was a single rifle cartridge, unfired, standing upright in the snow. The spotter picked it up. He turned it over in his gloved fingers. He understood what it meant. Not a threat, not a taunt, a statement. From someone who had enough rounds to solve a different kind of problem and chose not to. From someone who had made a decision about what kind of night this was going to be before the first headlight appeared in the valley. The spotter put the cartridge in his pocket. He started down the ridge. He didn't say anything else on the radio. Some things you carry quietly. The spotter's name was Alexei Borov, and he had been doing this work for 11 years. He had tracked targets across 3 continents. He had worked in conditions that most people hearing about them afterward would describe as impossible. And he had learned over 11 years that impossible was a word civilians used for things they had not yet tried. He was not arrogant about this. It was simply a fact about the job, the way a surgeon understands that opening a chest is possible because they have done it, not because it sounds easy. He had never left a mission with a cartridge in his pocket. He had never left a mission feeling like he had been the one being studied. He walked down the ridge in the dark, the unfired round in his left coat pocket, his hand around it, not because he was cold, but that wasn't it, but because the weight of it was something specific and real in a night that had become increasingly difficult to categorize. His team lead, a man named Petrov, who was 2 inches shorter than Borov and considerably less patient, was waiting for him at the base of the slope beside their vehicle. "You were up there an extra 9 minutes, Petrov said. "I know. The general is asking for a status report. Tell him we had no engagement." Borov got into the vehicle. He pulled the door shut. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the dark windshield. Petrov got in on the other side. He looked at Borov with the specific attention of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to know when something is wrong, and narrow enough to understand that asking directly is not always the right tool. What did you find up there? Borov thought about the 6 positions, the geometry of them. The cartridge standing upright in the snow like a period at the end of a sentence. A decision, Borov said. Petrov waited. Someone decided tonight was going to go a specific way before tonight started, Borov said. And it went that way. And we were part of how it went that way. We were planned for. He looked at Petrov. Does that mean anything to you? Because it means something to me, and I'm still working out what. Petrov said nothing for a moment. Then, we didn't confirm a target. No, the general's going to want an explanation. The explanation is that there was nothing to confirm. She was already gone from every position before we reached it. She moved like she knew our timeline. Borov paused. Because she did know our timeline. She built it into the plan before Volkov made the decision to send us. Petrov looked at the broken bridge in the distance, barely visible through the storm. Who is she? He said. Borov put his hand back in his pocket. He felt the cartridge. I don't know, he said, but I think she wanted us to ask that question. He started the vehicle. On the far side of the valley, in a concrete shelter that smelled like wet clothing and engine exhaust, in the particular sweetness of hot food being heated for coal people. 67 civilians were beginning the slow process of understanding that they had survived the night. It is not an instantaneous process, that understanding. The body knows first, in the way the body always knows before the mind catches up the release of a tension that has been held so long it stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like the normal state of things. The warmth of the shelter hit people differently. Some of them sat down heavily and didn't move. Some of them talked too fast about nothing important. Some of them cried with a quietness that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the body's way of handling relief, when relief is too large for any other response. Maya's father had not let go of her since Carl handed her over at the bridge approach. He was sitting on a bench along the shelter wall with Maya on his lap, his arms around her, and he was not talking and not crying and not doing anything except holding on, which was in that moment the only thing that mattered to him or that he was capable of. Carl was sitting 3 feet away with his hands between his knees and his eyes closed. He was breathing in a way that a doctor seeing it would have had opinions about. He was not thinking about his heart condition. He was thinking about the 7th step on the bridge, the place where his foot had found a section of deck that gave slightly, and about the way the bridge had sounded in the seconds before he cleared it, and about the way Maya's weight on his back had felt like both a burden and an anchor at the same time, and about how the two things being simultaneously true was something he did not have words for. Torres was across the room standing drinking coffee from a metal cup, looking at nothing. Patricia came and stood beside him. They stood together without talking for a while. Then she said, "Your hands are shaking." Torres looked at his hands. They were slightly. "Adrenaline," he said. "It takes a while to clear." "I know," she said. "Mine too." She held up her own hands. "Is this what it's like after something like this?" "I don't know," Torres said honestly. "This is the first time for me too." Patricia looked at him. "You seemed like you'd done it 100 times." "I was doing the job," he said. "The job has steps. You follow the steps and it keeps you from thinking about the thing underneath the steps." And now, he drank his coffee. "Now the steps are done," he said. She understood that. She put her hand on it for a moment, just a moment, and then she went to find Maya and her husband, and Torres stood there with his shaking hands and his empty steps and the coffee cooling in the cup and looked at the wall and breathed. Hayes came through the shelter door at 1:23 in the morning with snow on his shoulders, and Mitchell half of the step behind him. Hayes did a full count of the room with his eyes before he did anything else. It was automatic. It was the thing he had done in every room he had walked into for the past 26 years, and he was not aware of doing it anymore, the same way he was not aware of breathing. 67. All of them. He felt something move through his chest that he did not name, because naming it seemed like a smaller thing than it was. Ruth was sitting in a chair near the heating unit wrapped in a blanket. Someone had given her drinking tea from a paper cup. She looked up when Hayes came in. She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. "I told you I had opinions," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Hayes said. "Carrying a person without asking is presumptuous." "Yes, ma'am." I weigh 114 pounds, she said. I have been walking under my own power for 81 years. Yes, ma'am. That said, she looked at her tea. You ran very fast for a man your age. Hayes almost smiled. Thank you. Don't thank me. It wasn't a compliment so much as an observation. She sipped her tea. Is the bridge really gone? Yes, ma'am. She nodded slowly. And the people. Everyone. Everyone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and her voice was different now, lower the voice she used when she was saying something she had been carrying for a while. My husband used to say that every bridge has a purpose, and when the purpose is done, the bridge is done. He said the same thing about people. She looked up at Hayes. I think he was mostly wrong about people, but he might have been right about bridges. Hayes sat down in the empty chair beside her. He did not have anything to add to that. Sometimes the right response to a true thing is just to sit next to it. Mitchell stood near the door with his radio and his tally sheet and felt the room around him settle into something like stillness, and thought about the bridge, and thought about the counter-sniper team on the ridge, and thought about a woman he had never met who was somewhere in the storm between the ridge and wherever she was going next. I thought about the signal Delaney had received. One click. Done. He thought about what it cost to send a signal that simple from a situation that complicated. He thought he probably didn't have the math for it. On the extraction route, 31, in the morning, Emily Carter was 3 miles from the point where a vehicle would be waiting for her, moving through snow that was now over her boot tops in some sections, and she was not thinking about any of the things that Mitchell was attributing to her in the shelter. She was thinking about her left knee. The left knee had been a problem for 4 years since an extraction from a situation she was not going to think about while she was walking through snow in the dark, because thinking about past extractions while executing a current extraction was a category error that led to bad outcomes. The knee had a specific complaint about sustained movement in cold temperatures, which was that it produced a pain that started sharp and became dull, and then became something so continuous that it stopped being a signal and started being a condition. It was doing that now. She adjusted her gait. She kept moving. The radio in her coat was silent. She preferred it silent. Voice communication was a vulnerability in extraction. Anyone with the right equipment could localize a transmission. She had sent the one-click signal, and that was everything the command post needed and everything she intended to share until she reached the vehicle. She was thinking about the column. Specifically, she was thinking about Volkov's decision to stop at the bridge approach. She had built 3 versions of that moment into her planning, and the version that had actually happened was not any of them. She had planned for Volkov to push hard to the bridge and attempt a crossing. She had planned for Volkov to use artillery to accelerate the bridge's collapse. She had planned for Volkov to detour south toward the secondary crossing point. She had not planned for Volkov to stop because of civilians. That was the variable she had assessed as having the lowest probability. The intelligence profile on Volkov comprehensive, sourced, cross-referenced against documented behavior did not support it. The man who had ordered the shelling of the medical convoy was not by any reasonable behavioral model the man who stopped a division for civilians. And yet, she walked and thought about this and thought about what it meant when a person's documented behavior and their actual behavior diverged at a critical moment in what it said about the limits of any behavioral model and what it said about Volkov specifically, and the answer she kept arriving at was not comfortable. The answer was he was more complicated than the profile, which meant she had planned this night against a simplified version of him, which meant the night had succeeded partly because of her planning and partly because Volkov had made a decision that the planning had not anticipated a decision that happened to align with what the planning needed. She did not like owing success to something she had not controlled. She would think about that later in a warm place with coffee, and she would figure out what it meant for how she assessed people in the future. She would find the thing in the profile she had underweighted. She would find it because she always found it, because not finding it was not acceptable. For now, she walked. The extraction vehicle was a gray pickup truck with military plates that had been covered with mud to make them harder to read from a distance. The driver was a young woman named Specialist Chen, who had been sitting in the truck for 3 hours and 40 minutes with the engine running at intervals to keep the heat functional, and who was by Emily's arrival doing a specific kind of patient that involved drumming her fingers on the steering wheel in groups of 4. Emily got in the passenger side. Chen looked at her. "You're bleeding," Chen said. Emily looked at her left arm. The sleeve was dark below the elbow. She had been aware of this for some time. "It's minor," she said. "It's bleeding through your coat." "It's minor," Emily said again. "Drive." Chen drove. She did not push it further because she had driven for Emily before and she understood the rules of the arrangement, which were not complicated but were absolute. You asked once if the answer was drive, you drove. They were moving for about 4 minutes when Chen said carefully, "Is everyone across?" Emily looked at the road ahead. 67, she said. Chen absorbed this. The official count she had been given at the start of the night was 63. She had been a specialist long enough to understand what the difference between 63 and 67 meant in practice, and she did not have words for the weight of that difference that felt adequate to the situation. "Okay," she said. She drove. Emily closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She was not going to sleep in the truck. She was going to review the night in this specific, systematic way. She reviewed every night, cataloging the decisions in order, assessing each one, marking the places where the outcome had depended on luck or on someone else's choice rather than her own calculation. She was going to find the places where the plan had been stronger than necessary and the places where it had been thinner than she would have liked. She was going to find the medical convoy. It was there in the first 30 seconds of the review. The moment she had heard on the radio hours before she took position that Volkov's artillery had shelled a convoy with Red Cross markings. She had filed that fact with a specific tag in her working model of Volkov capable of civilian harm when strategic interest is sufficiently strong. She had set the weight of that tag high. She had used it to build the version of Volkov that she had planned against, the version that pushed hard regardless of who was in the way. She had been wrong, not completely. The artillery strike on the medical convoy was real. Volkov had ordered it. That was documented. But a person who orders artillery on a medical convoy and then stops a division at a bridge because civilians are crossing is not a contradiction. He was a man with a line. The line was just not where the profile said it was. She would find the things she had missed. She opened her eyes and looked at the road. Behind them in the valley, Volkov's engineers were already working the problem of the alternate crossing. They would find one. It would take hours. The region's defenders would use those hours. The corridor would hold at minimum until the strategic picture shifted enough to change the math. That was not her problem tonight. Tonight was done. Her arm hurt and her knee hurt, and she was thinking about Volkov's line and what she had missed in the profile and the weight of 67 versus 63. And none of these things resolved into anything except the road ahead and Chen driving steadily through the storm and the particular quiet of a night that had gone the way it needed to go. At the command post, 1:47 in the morning, Delaney received the confirmation signal from the extraction vehicle, 2 long clicks and 1 short Chen's personal authentication code, meaning the asset was secure and mobile. Delaney wrote the time in her log. She looked at the log for a moment. Then she closed it. She picked up the radio to Hayes. "Colonel, she's out." Hayes's voice came back from the shelter, steady and quiet in the way of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing and has received it. "Copy. Thank you, Delaney." "Sir," she paused. "Sir, the final count from the evacuation coordinator. 67 confirmed." A longer pause. 67, Hayes repeated. "Yes, sir." Another pause. The kind where you can hear a man doing arithmetic in his head and arriving at a number that has a specific gravity. "Official count was 63, he said. "Yes, sir." "Which means 4 people are alive tonight that the official count didn't know needed saving." "Yes, sir." Hayes was quiet for a moment, then, "Put that in the report exactly as it is. 67, don't change it." "Yes, sir." She put the radio down. Across the room, the night shift had begun, filtering in the fresh personnel, taking over the equipment and the monitors and the radio frequencies. The way a tide comes in and covers the ground that the previous tide had left. It is an ordinary thing, a shift change. It happens in every sustained operation, everywhere in the world. People are replaced by other people. The work continues. Delaney gathered her papers. She looked at the underlined number 1 more time. 67. She picked up her coat and walked to the door and stepped out into the storm, which was beginning at last to ease. Mitchell was outside already. He was standing at the edge of the tree line with his hands in his pockets and his face tilted up slightly toward the sky, the way people do sometimes when they need to be somewhere that isn't inside 4 walls. Delaney stood beside him. They stood there without talking. After a while, Mitchell said, "She's out, moving," Delaney said. "Good." He looked at the sky. "Does she know? Does she know how it went on the ground? The bridge, the people, all of it." "She hears the radio traffic. She knows the count." Delaney paused. "Whether she needs to know more than the count, I honestly couldn't tell you." Mitchell thought about that. The 4 extra people, she counted them herself. That would be my understanding, yes. She knew there were 67 before Hayes did, before any of us did. "She was watching from the ridge," Delaney said. "She had better sight lines, and she pays attention to that kind of thing." "To counting. To people," Delaney said. "She pays attention to people. The counting is just what that looks like from the outside." Mitchell turned that over. Somewhere in the dark, above them, past the tree line and past the ridge, a gray pickup truck was moving through the storm on a road that wasn't on any public map. Inside it, a woman with a bleeding arm and a bad knee and an 11-year-old intelligence profile that she was in the process of reconstructing was sitting in the passenger seat with her eyes closed and doing the kind of thinking that most people didn't know how to do at 2 in the morning after the night she had just had. Mitchell thought about the cartridge that the spotter had found in the snow. He had heard about it through Delaney's feeds and fragments in the pieces of radio traffic she had been monitoring all night. An unfired round standing upright in the packed snow at the last prepared position. Left deliberately, saying something. He thought about what it was saying. "Delaney," he said, "yeah. The cartridge the counter-sniper team found, the unfired one." Delaney looked at him. "What was she saying?" he asked. With that, Delaney was quiet for a moment. The storm moved through the trees above them. The sound of it was quieter now than it had been an hour ago. The worst was passing. "She was saying she chose," Delaney said. "That's all. She had the round. She had the target probably, and she chose not to. She put her hands in her coat pockets. She does that. She draws a line and she stays on her side of it. Doesn't matter what the tactical picture looks like. The line is the line." Mitchell stood with that. "It would have been easier," he said, "tactically, to take a different kind of shot, to remove people instead of equipment." "Yes," Delaney said, "but she didn't." "No," he looked at the sky. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely trying to understand. "In a situation that tight with that much at stake, why hold back from something that would make the tactical picture cleaner?" Delaney thought about how to answer that. She thought about the 2 times she had worked in operations where Emily was on the other end of a radio. She thought about the things Hayes had said, and the things Hayes had not said, and the things she had put together herself from the patterns of the work. "Because she decided before she took position what kind of night this was going to be," Delaney said. "She decided what she was and wasn't willing to do, and then she built a plan that accomplished the mission within those limits." She paused. "Most people under enough pressure, the limits compress. The line moves. She doesn't let the line move. Even if moving it would save more lives." "She would say that's a false choice," Delaney said. "She would say the moment you decide the line moves when the stakes are high enough, the line is already gone. It's not a line anymore. It's just a preference." She looked at the tree line, and she has no patience for preferences, only decisions. Mitchell let that settle. The cold was working its way through his coat now that he had stopped moving, and he should go inside, and he knew he should go inside, but he stood there a moment longer because the conversation felt like something he needed to finish before he let it go. "She went out there alone," he said. "No backup, no extraction guarantee. 1 rifle and a plan she built in her own head." "Yes. And she planned for the counter-sniper team. She planned for Volkov's decision cycle. She planned for the bridge failing. She planned for all of it." "Except for Volkov stopping at the bridge," Delaney said. "That wasn't in the plan." Mitchell looked at her. "What?" "She planned for him to push through, for him to push hard regardless of what was on the bridge. She built the timing around managing that push." Delaney paused. "Volkov stopping, deciding not to advance while civilians were crossing, that was his choice, not hers. The plan didn't require it." Mitchell absorbed this. "So she would have held him regardless," he said slowly. "She would have tried," Delaney said. "With the rounds she had left, in the positions she had prepared, and the time remaining. She would have tried." She paused again. "I don't know if she would have made it." The sentence sat between them in the cold air. Mitchell felt the weight of it in a specific place, low in the chest. the place where hard truths land when they arrive without warning. She was out of options, he said. She was running out, Delaney said. No. Yes. And she didn't signal that. She signaled a timeline compression, Delaney said. She sent 2 clicks, and then 1 and then 2. That's what it means. She doesn't send distress signals. That's not in her protocol. Because she doesn't ask for help. Because she decided before she went out there that no help was available, and she built her plan accordingly. Delaney's voice was level but not cold. It was the voice of someone who has had a long time to make peace with something that doesn't entirely settle. She's not trying to be a hero. She's just operating on a different set of assumptions about what's possible. Mitchell thought about the 6th position on the ridge. He thought about the unfired round standing upright in the snow. He thought about the choice it represented, made alone in the dark, in the middle of everything, with no one watching and no credit coming, and the counter-sniper team 40 meters below, and an armored column in the valley, and 67 people on a collapsing bridge. He thought about what it cost to hold a line when no one would ever know you held it. The spotter, he said, the one on the counter-sniper team. He found the positions, he found the cartridge. He's going to know what happened on that ridge. Some of it, Delaney said. Enough of it, Mitchell said. He's going to carry that. Yes, Delaney looked at the sky. Some stories don't stay contained, even when everyone involved would prefer them to. Inside the shelter, Hayes was sitting beside Ruth, who had fallen asleep in her chair with the paper cup still in her hand and the blanket pulled up to her chin. Hayes reached over and removed the cup from her fingers before it could fall. He set it on the floor. He looked at her face. She was sleeping the way very old people sometimes sleep, with a completeness that younger people have lost, the total surrender of it, the way the body finally takes what it was owed. Her husband had proposed to her on that bridge in November of 1967. The bridge was gone now, but Ruth was here. Hayes sat with that for a while and listened to the shelter around him, the murmur of voices and the sounds of people adjusting to warmth after cold, the small human noises of a group of people who had been through something together and were only beginning to understand that they had come out the other side. Torres was asleep in a corner with his head against the wall, his coffee cup on the floor beside him. Carl was talking quietly to a man Hayes didn't recognize, both of them sitting with their elbows on their knees, the posture of people having a conversation. They didn't have the words for, but were having anyway, because the alternative was silence. Maya was asleep in her father's lap. Her father was not asleep. I was holding her with both arms and looking at nothing and occasionally adjusting the way she was positioned. These tiny, careful adjustments, the way parents do when the child is asleep and they are not, and the night has been what it has been. Hayes watched him. He thought about the four people who had not been in the official count. The elderly man who had fallen, the woman who had helped him up, the 2 children who had briefly separated from their group. 4 people who were alive because someone on a ridge alone in the dark had been counting more carefully than anyone else. He thought about what it meant to pay that kind of attention to people you would never meet, people whose names you would never know, in conditions that would have prevented most trained observers from making any count at all. He thought about the decision that preceded the attention, the decision to count, the decision to look, the decision to go out there in the first place with limited ammunition and no backup, and a bridge that was already failing, and a timeline that had already compressed, and to build a plan that was good enough to hold the line between 67 people and everything that was coming for them. Hayes was not a sentimental man. He had built a career on the deliberate suppression of sentimentality in circumstances where it was a liability. He understood the value of that suppression. He did not apologize for it. But sitting beside Ruth in the warm shelter at 2 a.m, with the storm easing outside and 67 people breathing around him, he allowed himself one moment of something that was not sentimentality exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. I thought she was out there alone, and he thought she knew she might not make it, and he thought she went anyway. And he sat with that in the warm room with the sleeping woman beside him and the sounds of 67 people who did not know the name of the person who had kept them alive. And he did not try to put it into a category or file it in a report or translate it into the language of military assessment. He just sat with it because some things deserve that. They deserve to just be held quietly without being explained. In the truck at 2:09 a.m, Chen said, "We're 40 minutes out." Emily opened her eyes. She had been reviewing the profile. She had found it, the thing she had missed. It was in a footnote in a secondary assessment from 3 years ago, a behavioral analysis conducted after a different engagement, a different valley, a different set of choices. The footnote cited a witness account from a civilian interpreter who had been present when Volkov received news that his own family's village had been shelled in a conflict early in his career. The interpreter's account described Volkov's reaction as, and this was the word that had been in the footnote and that Emily had read and processed and then underweighted in her behavioral model grief. Not anger, not tactical reassessment, grief. A man who had experienced that kind of loss and responded to it with grief, rather than rage, had a specific relationship to civilian harm that the primary profile had not adequately captured. The primary profile had focused on the documented behavior, the decisions Volkov had made in the field, and had underweighted the internal architecture that produced those decisions. She had been modeling his actions. She should have been modeling his grief. The line he had drawn at the bridge was not a tactical line. It was a personal one, and she had almost built a plan that ran directly into it without knowing it was there, which meant the plan had succeeded in part because she had been wrong about the man, and being wrong about the man had in this particular case produced an outcome that her plan needed. That was the most uncomfortable kind of being wrong, the kind where the mistake works out. She made a note in her mind. She would update the assessment. She would find every other place where she had modeled behavior without modeling the grief underneath it. She was still thinking about this when Chen said, "Your arm needs stitches." "I know," Emily said. "Medical is standing by at the arrival point." "I know." "You're going to let them," Chen said. It was not quite a question. Emily looked at the dark road ahead. She thought about the night. She thought about the 6 positions in the unfired round, in the counter-sniper team, in the sound of the bridge falling, in the one-click signal she had sent when it was done. She thought about 67 people in a shelter on the far side of a valley. She thought about the 4th one, the second child, the small figure she had seen through the scope, briefly separated from the group, then recovered, then moving with the others toward the bridge, wearing a jacket that was bright enough to be visible, even in the storm, even at 800 meters, even through a scope that was fogged at the edges from the cold. She had almost missed that one, almost. She had caught the movement at the edge of her field of view and held position long enough to confirm, and then added the figure to her count and factored the additional person into her timing. 2 seconds of attention. That was all that had stood between the official count and the real one. 2 seconds. Emily thought about that for a moment. Then she looked at Chen. "Yes," she said. "I'll let them." Chen nodded. She drove. The storm was easing around them, the snow coming down slower now, the wind dropping the particular held breath quality of a night that has passed its worst and is beginning tentatively to let go. Emily watched it through the windshield. She was not done with the review. She would never be entirely done with the review. That was not a complaint. It was the nature of the work, and she had chosen the work, and she had chosen it with full knowledge of what that meant, which was that you never entirely closed the file on any night, because every night fed forward into the next assessment and the next plan and the next ridge above the next valley with the next impossible timeline. You carried it, all of it. The decisions and the near misses and the places where the plan was thinner than you wanted and the places where someone else's grief became the variable that saved you. You carried it because it was yours, and because carrying it was how you made sure the next plan was better. The truck moved through the dark, 40 minutes out. Emily closed her eyes again. She went back to the footnote. She went back to the word that had been there all along, waiting for her to give it the weight it deserved. Grief. She worked with it. And the storm eased around the truck, and the night moved toward morning, and in a shelter on the far side of a broken bridge. 67 people breathed in the warmth of a room they would remember for the rest of their lives without ever knowing the name of the reason they were in it. The medical station was a converted supply room at the back of a forward operating base that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee and the particular staleness of a room that had been running on recycled air for too long. There were 4 cots, 2 examination tables, and a young Army doctor named Captain Sarah Okafor, who had been awake for 19 hours and who looked at Emily Carter's arm with the focused attention of someone who has learned to separate what they are feeling from what they are doing, because what they are doing cannot afford what they are feeling. The wound was a graze, a long one deep enough to need closing, shallow enough that it had not touched anything structural. The kind of wound that hurts considerably more than it looks like it should, which is its own category of misery. Okafor cleaned it without preamble, her hands efficient and certain, and said nothing about it until she had the first suture in. Then she said, "You drove 40 minutes with this open." "It was slowing down," Emily said. "That's not the same as stopped." Okafor pulled the next suture through with the precise tension of someone who has done this enough times that the motion lives in her hands without requiring her full attention. "How long were you out there?" "Long enough." "That's also not a number." "No," Emily agreed. Okafor looked up at her for a moment, not with irritation, with the specific assessment of a doctor who has learned to read patients through what they don't say as much as what they do. Emily met her eyes without expression, not hostility, just the particular neutrality of someone who has spent years making their face into a surface that does not give information away. Okafor went back to the sutures. "Your blood pressure is elevated," she said. "I know. Your core temperature was below normal when you came in. It's coming up." "Yes, it is." Okafor tied off the suture and reached for the next. "You've been here before. Not this room. This situation." It was not a question. Emily did not answer it as one. "The knee," Okafor said, moving on. "You're favoring the left." "Old injury." "How old?" "Older than tonight." Okafor finished the last suture and set down her instruments and covered the wound with a clean dressing with the neat practice movements of someone who takes the ending of a procedure as seriously as its beginning. Then she peeled off her gloves and looked at Emily directly. "You need sleep," she said. "I need a debrief," Emily said. "After sleep." "The debrief is at 0600. It is now 2:47 in the morning," Okafor said. "You have 3 hours and 13 minutes. You are going to use them horizontally, or I am going to find someone with more authority than either of us to make that a medical order." Emily looked at her. Okafor did not look away. This was, Emily noted, not a common response to sustained eye contact from someone with her particular combination of reputation and expression. Most people found reasons to look somewhere else. Okafor did not find those reasons. She stood her ground with the specific confidence of a woman who had decided that medicine was the largest authority in this room and was prepared to defend that position. Emily lay down on the cot. Okafor turned off the overhead light and left the small lamp on the desk. 3 hours, Emily said, not to Okafor specifically, more to the room. 3 hours and 13 minutes, Okafor said from the doorway. "Don't waste them arguing with the math." She left. Emily stared at the ceiling in the low light. She was not going to sleep in 3 minutes. She knew this about herself. Her nervous system after an operation of this duration required approximately 40 minutes of decompression before it would permit anything resembling actual rest. This was not a complaint. It was a fact about how she was built, and she had made her peace with it years ago. The same way she made her peace with everything about how she was built by incorporating it into her planning rather than wishing it were different. She used the 40 minutes. She went back through the night in full from the moment she had taken the first position to the moment she had sent the one-click signal, and she did it properly this time, not the abbreviated review she had done in the truck. Every decision, every calculation, every moment where the outcome had depended on something other than the plan. There were more of those moments than she typically produced. That bothered her in a specific way. Not the moments themselves. Those were the texture of real operations you planned as well as you could, and you adapted to the gap between the plan and reality as intelligently as you could, and you accepted that the gap would exist. What bothered her was the size of the gap, the number of variables that had resolved in directions she had not anticipated. Volkov's grief, the bridge's timing, the counter-sniper team arriving earlier than her model predicted. 3 significant variables. Any one of them could have changed the night's outcome. She thought about that. She thought about 67 people in a shelter who did not know that 3 significant variables had resolved in directions she had not controlled. She thought about what it meant to do this work. Really do it, not the version that got told in briefing rooms and read into operational assessments, but the actual work, the thing that happened in the dark on a ridge above a frozen river while a bridge failed underneath the weight of people who trusted that someone was out there making the math work. The actual work was this: you did everything you could control as well as you possibly could, and then you held the line where the controllable ended and the uncontrollable began, and you did not break on that line, and sometimes the uncontrollable variables went your way, and sometimes they did not, and the only honest thing you could say about tonight was that they had gone your way, and 67 people were alive, and you did not know, could not know, would never know whether the plan would have held if any one of those variables had gone differently. Emily Carter had never told anyone that. She had never told anyone because she had never been asked in a way that the question deserved, and because the answer in the wrong context sounded like doubt. And doubt was a currency that got people killed when it circulated in the wrong places. But in the low light of a converted supply room alone, at 2:53 in the morning, she held the honest version of the night in her head without flinching from it. She had done everything she could. The rest had been the night's decision, and the night this time had decided to let 67 people live. She closed her eyes. She slept. At 4:22 in the morning, the shelter on the far side of the valley was quieter than it had been 2 hours earlier. Most of the civilians had been transported to a secondary facility farther from the operational area, warmer and more permanent, and staffed with people whose specific job was the transition from crisis to something approaching normal. The shelter retained a small number, the people who were still being assessed medically, the people who had requested to stay until morning, and a handful of soldiers managing the transition. Torres was still there. He had been offered transport twice and declined both times, not because he had a specific reason to stay, but because leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't make precise enough to articulate. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs extended in front of him, and he was doing what he had been doing for most of the last hour, which was looking at the wall across the room and not thinking about anything specific and thinking about everything specific simultaneously. Carl was asleep on a cot in the medical assessment area. A doctor had looked at him about an hour ago and said things that Torres had not been close enough to hear clearly, but that had produced in Carl an expression that was not surprise. Just the expression of a man receiving information he had been carrying for a while and was now being told out loud by someone who had measured it. Torres had not asked about it. He had stayed in the room. Ruth was awake. She had slept for about an hour and woken with the clarity that some very old people have the way they move from sleep to full consciousness without the gradient that younger people require. She was sitting with her blanket and looking around the room with the attentiveness of someone who has decided to observe what is in front of them rather than think about what is not. She looked at Torres for a while. Then she said from across the room, "Young man." Torres looked up. "Come sit here," she said. He got up. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, the one Hayes had occupied earlier. Ruth looked at him with those clear eyes. "How old are you?" she said. 20, he said. She absorbed this. "I have shoes older than you." "Yes, ma'am. Tonight was your first time." It was not a question. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact she had observed and was now naming, not looking for confirmation, but not dismissing the possibility of it either. "Yes, ma'am," Torres said. "And you went back onto the bridge," she said, "after you brought Patricia across. You went back for the last 5. Torres looked at his hands. "There were people still on it." "Yes," Ruth said, "there were, and there were also other soldiers. They were managing the approach. Someone had to go back onto the span itself." "You chose to," Ruth said. "That's different from had to." Torres was quiet for a moment. "I guess it is," he said. Ruth studied him. What did it feel like going back? He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like the right direction," he said finally. I don't know how to make it sound less simple. It just felt like the direction I was supposed to be going." Ruth nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already decided. "My husband was a firefighter for 31 years, she said. He said the same thing. He said, you stop feeling the fear when you stop thinking about the choice. When going back becomes the only direction your body knows." Does it come back?" Torres asked. "The fear afterward." "Oh yes," Ruth said. She said it simply without drama. "It comes back. That's how you know you did something real." She looked at him steadily. "But it comes back different. It comes back with something else attached to it. And in time, the something else is what you remember." Torres looked at her. "What's the something else?" he said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That depends on the person," she said. "For some people it's pride, for some it's peace." She thought about it. "For my husband it was always gratitude. He said he was grateful every time he got to go back in, because going back in meant someone needed him. And being needed was the thing he was built for. She looked at Torres. What are you built for? It was the kind of question that from someone else in a different moment would have felt like too much, too direct, too large for 4:30 in the morning in a shelter with the storm easing outside. From Ruth at this moment, it felt like exactly the right size. Torres thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, he said, but tonight felt like a practice run for finding out. Ruth looked at him for another moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and patted his hand, once, firm and brief, the way a person delivers a thing they mean completely. Good answer, she said. At 5:17 in the morning, Hayes arrived at the forward operating base. I had ridden in a transport vehicle with 3 of his staff and spent the journey reviewing the night's communications log on a tablet, making notes in the margins in handwriting that was small and precise and would be illegible to anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read it. He was not thinking about sleep. He was thinking about the debrief at 0600, about the report he would need to file, about the operational assessment that would determine how the night's events were characterized in the language of official record. Language mattered. He had learned this early and never unlearned it. The words chosen to describe a thing shaped how the thing was understood by people who were not there, and people who were not there made decisions about resources and future operations based on their understanding, and those decisions had consequences for people who were present in the next situation. The gap between what happened and what was written about it was not neutral, it had weight. I was going to get the language right. He was going to put 67 in the report with an explanation of the discrepancy from the official count of 63, and he was going to be precise about what the discrepancy represented for people who were alive because someone had counted when the system had not. I was also going to include in the section of the report that addressed the tactical situation a description of actions taken at the bridge that was honest about what those actions were and what they required from the person who took them. Not the legend version, not the ghost version, the version that acknowledged a human being who had been cold and alone and working against a timeline that had compressed past its planned parameters and who had held the line anyway. He would not use her name. Her name was not his to use in a report, but he would describe what she had done with enough clarity that anyone reading the report with serious attention would understand the shape of the person behind it. He got out of the transport vehicle. Delaney was waiting for him at the entrance to the operations building. She's here, Delaney said. Medical. Cleared. Sleeping last, I heard. Okafor said she went down around 3 and should be up before 0600. Hayes nodded. The counter sniper team, he said. Back with the column. Borov the spotter filed a report. Delaney handed Hayes a single printed page. He was thorough. Hayes took the page and read it. He read it twice. His expression did not change during the first reading. During the second reading, something shifted very slightly in the area around his eyes, and then it settled back. He handed the page back to Delaney. He found all 6 positions, Hayes said. Yes, sir. And the cartridge. Yes, Hayes was quiet for a moment. He described the geometry of the positions. He did. The way they were laid out relative to each other. The sight lines. Yes. Hayes looked at the door into the operations building. He understood what he was looking at. I think he did, sir, yes. A pause. Is he going to talk about it? Hayes said. Delaney thought about this. He's a professional, she said. He'll file the report. He'll answer what he's asked. She paused. But I think he put that cartridge in his pocket, and I think he's going to carry it for a long time, and I think he knows what it means. And I think I could be wrong about this, sir, but I think he's going to let it mean what it means without turning it into something louder than that. Hayes looked at her. You think he respects it, Hayes said. I think he recognized something on that ridge that he doesn't have a category for, Delaney said. And I think the honest response to that for a person like him is to be quiet about it. Hayes nodded once. He went inside. At 5:51 in the morning, Emily Carter was awake. She had been awake for 12 minutes, which was enough time to wash her face and check the dressing on her arm and drink half of the coffee that Chen had left on the desk outside the medical room sometime in the last 2 hours. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. She was sitting at the desk with a pad of paper and a pen, not writing, just holding the pen, when Hayes knocked on the open door. She looked up. He came in and sat in the chair across the desk from her the same way she had been doing with desks and chairs her entire operational career. Both of them defaulting to the posture of a conversation that has something to settle. Hayes looked at her arm. Okafor's were, he said. Yes. She's good. She is. Emily set down the pen. You read the night log? I did. And you have questions? Several, Hayes said. I'm going to ask most of them in the debrief. There's one I'm asking now. Emily waited. The four, Hayes said. The difference between 63 and 67. You counted them yourself from the ridge. Yes. At what point early, Emily said. First hour of observation, before the column entered the valley. Hayes was quiet for a moment. We had a count of 63 from the evacuation coordinator, confirmed through two separate teams. Your teams were counting at the staging area, Emily said. Two of the four reached the staging area after the initial count. Two others approached via a route that bypassed the staging area entirely. The elderly man who fell, he was off the route for approximately 11 minutes. He was counted as having already crossed. Hayes processed this. He almost didn't make it back to the group, he said. I was struggling, Emily said. The woman who helped him, she was with a separate family. She stopped. She didn't have to stop. She stopped because she saw someone struggling, and stopping was the human response. Emily paused. She is also not in the original count. Hayes sat with this. You watched all of that, he said, from 800 meters, in a blizzard, while managing a tactical situation. The tactical situation was manageable, Emily said. The counting required attention. Hayes looked at her. Not the way officers look at assets, not the way commanders look at resources, the way one person looks at another person when they have seen without intending to see it something fundamental about who that person is. Emily did not look away from it. She also did not respond to it because there was nothing to say that would be smaller than the thing itself. The debrief is in 7 minutes, Hayes said. I know. He stood up. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he said something that he had not planned to say and that he would not put in any report. Thank you, he said. It was 2 words. It was entirely inadequate. It was the only thing available. Emily picked up the cold coffee. Don't thank me, she said. Count them. Hayes looked at her. Count all of them, she said. Not 63, 67. Every time the number comes up in any report, any debrief, any conversation. 67. I will, Hayes said. Because that's the only count that's true, she said. And the truth of the count is the only thing that matters. Hayes left. Emily drank the cold coffee. She thought about the debrief. She thought about the questions she would answer and the questions she would not. And the difference between those categories and the specific discipline required to maintain that difference when the person asking had the authority and the relationship to make the discipline difficult. She thought about the footnote, grief. She thought about Volkov standing at the edge of the bridgehead in the dark and looking at the river and saying nothing. She thought about a cartridge standing upright in the snow at the 6th position. She thought about what the spotter had carried down the ridge in his pocket. She thought about choices, not the tactical kind, the other kind, the kind that happen at the level underneath tactics, the level where a person decides what they are before the situation arrives to test it. Volkov had a line, she had a line. The lines were not the same line, but they were both lines. And she thought, sitting at the desk in the converted supply room at 5:58 in the morning, with cold coffee and a sutured arm and 3 hours of sleep and a debrief in 2 minutes, that this was the thing that the legends always lost. The legends made the people in them into something that did not have lines, something that did not feel the weight of the choice, something that moved through impossible situations without the specific human cost of moving through impossible situations. But the weight was real, the cost was real, and the lines, the places where a person said this far and not further and meant it and held it even when holding, it was harder than not holding it. Those were the most real things of all. She stood up. She picked up the pad of paper. She went to the debrief. The room was small and the table was metal, and there were 4 people at it. Hayes, Delaney Mitchell, and a colonel named Reyes, who was the senior intelligence officer and who Emily had worked adjacent to in 2 previous operations and whose methods she respected without being entirely comfortable with. They sat down. Reyes opened a folder. Captain Carter, he said, let's begin with the initial assessment. At what point did you determine the Jefferson Bridge was the critical point? Emily looked at the folder. She thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was approximately 6 hours before Hayes received the report about the secondary route being compromised. Because she had been tracking the column's approach vector for 4 days, and had run the contingencies against the terrain, and the bridge was the only structure in the valley with the particular combination of vulnerability and necessity that made it the thing everything else depended on. She had known before anyone at the command post that tonight was going to come down to the bridge. She said early enough to prepare. Reyes looked at her. How early, he said. The report is in the log, Emily said. The timing of my position is time-stamped. I'm asking about the assessment, not the movement. Emily looked at him steadily. The assessment preceded the movement. Reyes paused. Hayes across the table was looking at his notes. He was not looking at Emily or Reyes. His face was entirely neutral. Mitchell beside Hayes was watching the exchange with the specific attentiveness of someone who is learning the shape of something they don't yet have a name for. Reyes made a note. The counter-sniper team, he said, and your decoy device. Can you walk us through the construction and deployment? Emily walked them through it. She was precise. She was thorough. She gave them everything they needed to understand what had happened and why it had worked and how it fit into the overall sequence of the night. She was generous with operational detail and economical with everything else. And the difference between those two categories was not something she flagged. It was just the way the debrief went. 40 minutes in, Reyes leaned back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said the column's behavior at the bridge approach. Volkov stopping when he identified civilian presence. Yes, Emily said. That was not in your assessment of his likely behavior. No, Emily said. It was outside the behavioral model. Yes, which means the timeline in the final 8 minutes depended on a variable you had not controlled. Yes, Emily said. It did. Reyes looked at her. Are you comfortable with that? He said. The question landed differently than the others. Not because it was harder, technically. Because it was honest. Reyes, for all that she did not find him comfortable, was asking the thing that the debrief was actually about underneath all the operational specifics. He was asking whether she could account for the gap between the plan and what the plan had needed from the uncontrollable. She looked at him directly. No, she said. The room was very quiet. I'm not comfortable with it, she said. I missed something in the profile. I've identified what I missed and I'll correct it. But the honest answer to your question is that tonight required things I didn't plan and couldn't control, and 67 people are alive, partly because those things resolved in the necessary direction, and I cannot tell you with certainty that the plan would have held if they hadn't. The honesty of it filled the room. Hayes stopped writing. Mitchell stopped breathing for a moment. Reyes looked at Emily Carter for a long time. Then he said, that is the most honest debrief assessment I have received in 14 years of conducting debriefs. Emily said nothing. It is also, Reyes said, precisely the kind of assessment that makes you worth what you cost. He closed the folder. We're done. He stood up, he picked up his folder and his pen, and he walked to the door and he stopped there and he looked back at Emily. The 4, he said, the ones the official count missed. Yes, Emily said. The report will reflect 67. Hayes already confirmed that, she said. I'm confirming it again, Reyes said, because it matters to me personally that the number is right. He paused. My mother was a civilian in a situation 23 years ago where the count was wrong. The count was wrong by 2. She was one of the 2 that the count missed. He looked at Emily. Someone counted correctly. Someone insisted on the right number. She is 84 years old and she is the reason I am in this room. He paused again. 67, he said, every time. He left. The room held the weight of that for a moment. Then Mitchell let out the breath he had been holding slowly through his nose, and it was the sound of someone releasing something they didn't know they'd been holding. Hayes put down his pen. He looked at Emily. She was looking at the door where Reyes had been. She was thinking about a woman who was 84 years old because someone had counted correctly. She was thinking about the second child on the bridge in the bright jacket at the edge of her field of view. 2 seconds of attention. The distance between a number that was wrong and a number that was right. She thought about that. She sat with it in the quiet room in the early morning, with the storm finally easing outside and the night settling into the past where it would stay permanent and complete, where nothing could change it anymore. 67, all of them, every one. The debrief ended at 7:14 in the morning. Emily walked out of the room and down the corridor and out the side door of the operations building into air that was cold and clean and no longer carrying snow. The storm had passed while they were inside. The sky was still dark at the edges, but beginning at the horizon to separate into the particular gray-blue that precedes actual light. Not dawn yet, the promise of it. She stood outside for a moment and breathed. Her arm ached under the dressing. Her knee was doing the thing it did after sustained cold exposure, the deep bone-level complaint that she had learned to negotiate with rather than fight. She was tired in the way that lives below the surface of ordinary tiredness. The kind that sleep helps, but does not cure, the kind that requires something other than hours. She was thinking about Reyes. She was thinking about his mother, 84 years old, alive, because someone had insisted on the right number 23 years ago. She was thinking about the specific shape of that story. Not dramatic, not military, not the kind of thing that gets told in briefing rooms or written into operational assessments. Just a woman who was alive. Just a number that was right instead of wrong. Just someone somewhere paying attention when paying attention was hard. She was thinking about how many of those stories existed in the world, the ones nobody told. The ones where the margin was 2 seconds of attention in a blizzard, or a footnote about grief that changed a behavioral model, or a woman in a wheelchair who got carried across a bridge because a colonel decided that protocol could wait. The stories where the critical thing was not the dramatic action, but the decision underneath it. The decision about what mattered and what didn't. The decision about where the line was. She heard footsteps behind her. Mitchell. He came and stood beside her in the cold air and said nothing, which was the right call. She had noticed over the course of the night's events that Mitchell had a reliable instinct for when silence was the correct response. It was not a common instinct in people his age, and it was not a common instinct in military environments where silence was frequently interpreted as a vacancy to be filled. He wore it naturally. They stood there for a moment. Then he said Reyes what he said about his mother. Yes, Emily said. Did you know that about him? No, she said. It changes how you read the debrief, Mitchell said, knowing that. It changes how you read him, Emily said. The debrief was what it was regardless. Mitchell thought about that. He knew what the count meant, he said, personally, before you said a word about it. Yes. And he still pushed on the behavioral model question, still asked the hard thing. That's his job, Emily said. Knowing what something means personally doesn't change what the bond requires. It just changes what you carry while you do it. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" Something. Emily looked at the horizon. You can ask, she said. The cartridge, he said. The one you left at the 6th position. Standing upright. She did not say anything. Borov found it, Mitchell said. I know you know that. You built the positions knowing someone would reconstruct the sequence eventually. You knew someone would find the last one. Yes, she said. So you left it for him, Mitchell said. Not randomly, for the specific person who would be skilled enough to work backward through the whole sequence. I left it for anyone who found it, Emily said. I didn't know which one of them would do the reconstruction. But you knew one of them would. I thought it was probable, she said. Yes. Mitchell turned this over. Why, buddy? Emily was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, because he needed to know. Borov. Whoever found it. They needed to know that the night was a choice, not a force of nature, not an overwhelming tactical situation that resolved itself. A choice made by a person, with enough rounds left to make a different choice. She paused. People on both sides of a line need to understand the line exists, otherwise the line stops existing. Mitchell looked at her. You were communicating, he said, across the line. I was stating a fact, Emily said, across the line. Mitchell breathed out slowly. He thought about Borov sitting on the rock in the snow, working backward through 6 positions, finding the cartridge, standing upright in the packed snow at the 6th position like a period at the end of a sentence. He thought about what Borov had felt in that moment, and he thought about the cartridge in Borov's pocket, and he thought about what Delaney had said, some things you carry quietly. He's going to tell people, Mitchell said. Eventually, not in a report, but he's going to tell the story. Probably, Emily said. Is that what you wanted? She looked at the horizon. I wanted the 67 to cross, she said. Everything else was secondary. She said it the way she said most true things, simply without decoration, without asking for a response. The way a person states something they have understood for a long time and have never needed to argue for. Mitchell nodded. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the lightning sky. What happens now? He said. For you. I go somewhere else, she said. Another situation. Another situation, she said. Different valley, different bridge, different math. Same work, Mitchell said. Same work, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, the way she looked at everything directly, without blinking, with the full attention of someone who has trained themselves to see what is actually there rather than what they expect or hope or fear might be there. Her face in the early morning light was tired and steady and entirely itself. Can I tell you something, he said. You can tell me, she said. Tonight changed how I think about this job, he said. Not the tactics, not the operational side. He paused, searching for the right word, the why of it, the reason for the decisions underneath the decisions. She waited. I came into this thinking the job was about outcomes, he said. About results, numbers. Whether the mission succeeded or failed. And tonight was about outcomes, yes. But it was also about something that the outcomes grew from. Something about who you are before the situation arrives. About the decisions you make in advance, about what kind of person you're going to be when things get impossible. He stopped. He looked at her. You decided all of that before you took the first position, he said. Didn't you? It was not quite a question. Emily looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said. How long ago, he said. She thought about this honestly. A long time, she said. Before the army, before any of this. There was a moment I was young and someone needed help and I could help, or I could not help and I chose to help. And afterward, I understood something. I understood that I was the kind of person who chose to help. Not because it was required, because it was true. She paused. Once you know what you are, the decisions get simpler. Not easier, simpler. Mitchell sat with that. That's what the line is, he said quietly. That's what you meant. The line isn't a rule, it's a description. Yes, Emily said, a description of who you already are. Yes. He nodded slowly. The sky was getting lighter. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Emily said, you went out of the building after Hayes last night. I saw you follow him. Mitchell looked at her. You saw that from the ridge. I was repositioning, she said. The command post was in my sight line for approximately 40 seconds. I saw two people leave the building. The second one was moving fast, like someone who had decided something quickly. She paused. Why did you go? Mitchell thought about this. Same reason Torres went back on the bridge, he said. It was the right direction. Emily looked at him. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller than a smile, but occupying the same neighborhood. Good answer, she said. They stood outside for another few minutes. Then Emily went inside to find Chen and Mitchell stood alone in the early morning air and watched the horizon go from gray-blue to actual light, the specific moment when the sky commits to the day, and he thought about lines and descriptions and the decisions that get made before the situations arrive to test them. He thought about what he was. He thought he was beginning to know. Inside the operations building at 8:03 in the morning, Hayes was at the desk in his temporary office writing the report. He had been at it since the debrief ended. He wrote quickly and he wrote carefully the way he always wrote, when the writing mattered, with the specific attention of a man who understood that the words chosen today would shape the understanding of people who would never stand where he had stood or see what he had seen. He wrote 67 every time the number appeared. He wrote it without footnote or asterisk or explanatory parenthetical. He wrote it as the fact it was. He wrote about the bridge and the column and the timeline and the tactical sequence. And he wrote about the decoy device and the counter sniper team and the communications disruption. And he wrote about all of it with the precision his training required and the honesty his conscience required. And where those two things pulled in different directions, he let the conscience win. He reached the section of the report that addressed the asset. He stopped writing. He sat for a moment. He thought about what he had said to her, thank you. He thought about what she had said, don't thank me, count them. He thought about the way she had said it, not cold, not dismissive, not the way people say things when they want to redirect attention. The way people say things when they want to direct attention, when they want you to understand what the thing was actually about. Count them. He wrote the asset's primary contribution to this operation was not the disruption of the armored column's advance, though that disruption was significant and effective. The primary contribution was the accurate enumeration and monitoring of the evacuation's full scope. The official count preceding the operation was 63. The actual number of civilians requiring evacuation was 67. The discrepancy was identified and tracked by the asset from the initial position. Before the tactical engagement began, all 67 were successfully evacuated. The 4 individuals absent from the official count are alive. That is the number this operation should be remembered by. He read it back. He left it as written. He kept going. At 9:31 in the morning, in a secondary civilian facility, 40 minutes from the forward operating base, Ruth was sitting in a room with a window. The room was warmer than the shelter had been, and the window looked out on nothing particularly significant, a parking area, some trees, the beginning of a road that went somewhere. But the light coming through it was the first real daylight Ruth had seen in what felt like a very long time. And she was sitting in it with the deliberate intention of a person who has decided that this specific thing right now deserves her full attention. A young woman from the facility's civilian liaison office had come by earlier with paperwork and questions about next steps and temporary accommodation arrangements, and Ruth had answered everything she was asked with the patient efficiency she had applied to practical matters for 8 decades. And then the young woman had left, and Ruth had returned to the window and the light. She was thinking about the bridge, not the falling of it, the bridge before the falling, the bridge as it had been in November of 1967, when Howard had brought her there on a cold Saturday afternoon and asked her in the way Howard did everything directly and without preamble whether she thought they should get married. He had not gotten down on one knee. He had not produced a ring, which came later. He had just asked the way he asked everything that mattered, straight out, looking at her, no cushioning. She had said yes. She had said it the same way, because they were both people who said true things directly, and the truth was yes, and there was no reason to wrap a true thing in anything except itself. The bridge was gone. Howard was gone. Both facts had the same quality now in the morning light, not the sharp quality of fresh loss, the settled quality of things that have been carried long enough to become part of the weight you walk with, present and permanent and survivable. She thought about the night. She thought about Hayes running with her in his arms. She thought about Torres going back onto the bridge. She thought about the sound the bridge had made in those last minutes, that deep, committed sound of something giving everything it had left. And she thought about whoever had been out there, in the dark, in the storm, and the impossible arithmetic of the night. She did not know the name. She did not need to know the name. She knew what the name represented, which was someone who had looked at a situation that most people would have looked away from and decided to stay, decided to count, decided to hold the line until the line could be released. She thought about Howard. He would have found this extremely dramatic. He also would have understood it completely, because Howard had spent 31 years going into buildings that were on fire, and he had never described it as bravery, and he had never described it as heroism. And the one time someone at a dinner had called him a hero, he had looked genuinely puzzled and said, "I just knew where the people were. I just went where the people were." Ruth thought about that. She thought about someone on a ridge above a frozen river, lone in a blizzard, who had counted 67 people when everyone else had counted 63, who just knew where the people were, who just went where the people were. She put her hand on the window glass. She felt the cold of it through her palm. "Good work," she said quietly, not to the window, not to the room, to the person she would never meet, who had done the thing that needed doing in the dark without anyone watching because it needed doing. At 11:47 in the morning, Borov was in his bunk in the columns camp on the west side of the valley, staring at the tent ceiling, not sleeping. He had not slept since the mission. He had filed a report. He had answered Marchetti's questions and Volkov's one question, which had been delivered in person and which had been simply nothing to report. And Borov had said, "No confirmed target." And Volkov had looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who is deciding whether to push further on something, and then Volkov had said, "Understood," and walked away. Borov had the cartridge on the small folding table beside his bunk. He had taken it out of his pocket when he got back. He had set it on the table and looked at it. He had cleaned his equipment and written the report and answered the questions and eaten breakfast and done all of the procedural things that structure provides for exactly this kind of moment. And now he was in his bunk staring at the ceiling, and the cartridge was on the table, and he was still thinking about the 6th position. The geometry of it. I had reconstructed the full sequence in his head a dozen times. 6 positions across 2 hours and 40 minutes of active engagement. The sequence of disruptions to the column's advance, each one precisely calibrated, none of them what they appeared to be on the surface. The decoy device that had been so simple and so perfectly placed that he was not entirely sure he would have thought of it under similar constraints. The movement between positions that left the minimum possible trace and used the terrain the way, and this was the comparison he kept returning to, the way a native uses terrain. Not the way someone trained to use terrain uses it. The way someone who has understood terrain for so long that the understanding is no longer conscious. And then the sixth position, and the cartridge. Standing upright, he picked it up now. He held it the way he had held it on the ridge. He thought about the choice it represented. The round in the chamber, the assessment of the target, the decision not to take the shot. In conditions where the shot was available, the shot was potentially decisive. The shot would have neutralized the counter-sniper threat and given the sniper on the ridge an extended operational window. She had chosen not to take it, not because she couldn't, because she had decided before the night started what kind of night it was going to be, what kind of person she was going to be in it. Borov had been a soldier for 11 years. He had made choices in the field. He had taken shots that he had to take, and he had declined shots that he had decided not to take, and he had lived with all of those decisions in the way soldiers live with them, which is to say imperfectly, but honestly carrying what you carry and doing what you do with what you have left. He had never in 11 years encountered the specific thing he had encountered on that ridge, a line. Not a tactical decision, not a calculated trade-off, a line. The kind of line that doesn't move when the pressure increases. The kind of line that is drawn before the night starts and held until the night ends, regardless of what the night asks of you. He sat up. He looked at the cartridge in his hand. He made a decision. He picked up a pen and a small piece of paper from the table, and he wrote 4 words on it. He folded the paper around the cartridge. He put it in a different pocket, not the field pocket where he kept operational materials, but the interior pocket of his personal jacket, the one where he kept the photograph of his daughter and the small folded letter from his wife that he had been carrying for 3 deployments. The things you carry because they are yours, because they mean something that doesn't need explaining. He lay back down. He looked at the ceiling. I thought about his daughter. She was 7 years old and she had her mother's eyes, and she asked questions with the relentless focused curiosity of a child who has decided that the world is interesting and intends to investigate it fully. The last question she had asked him before this deployment, standing at the door of their apartment with her coat half on because they were running late, but she needed to know this first, was, "Papa, how do you know when you're doing the right thing?" He had told her the answer he believed at the time, which was, because it feels right. She had looked at him with the expression of a child who was deciding whether to accept an answer or push further. She had pushed further. "But what if it doesn't feel like anything?" she had said. "What if you're too scared to feel?" He had not had a good answer for that. He had an answer now. He would tell her, because you decided before the fear arrived. You decided who you were going to be before the situation arrived to test it. And then when the situation arrived, you did not decide again. You just did what you had already decided. He would tell her, "Someone taught me that, without meaning to, without knowing I was learning." He closed his eyes. He put his hand over the interior pocket. He felt the slight weight of the folded paper and the cartridge inside it. He slept. 3 weeks after the night at Jefferson Bridge, Lieutenant Ryan Mitchell was transferred to a different posting. It was not a punishment transfer. It was the ordinary kind, the kind that happens in military careers as a matter of organizational need and personnel management, the kind that most soldiers experience as the background rhythm of the profession. He packed his things and said the necessary goodbyes and rode in a transport vehicle to his new assignment, and the whole process was unremarkable in every external detail. Internally, it was not unremarkable. He spent the journey thinking about the 3 weeks since the bridge. He had written his own account of the night, not an official report, just a personal account, the kind that he kept in the green notebook he had been writing in since his first posting, because he had read somewhere that writing things down was how you understood them, and he had found this to be true. The account was 12 pages. He had written it 3 times, each time finding that the previous version had gotten something wrong. Not the facts were the same each time, but the understanding, the way the facts connected to something larger. The 3rd version was the one he kept. In it, he wrote about Hayes and Delaney and Torres and Carl and Ruth and Dorothy and Patricia and Maya's father. And he wrote about Reyes and what Reyes had said about his mother. He wrote about the counter-sniper team and the cartridge in the sixth position and Borov sitting on a rock working backward through a sequence he had been part of without knowing it. He wrote about Emily Carter. He wrote her name once at the beginning, and then he used her call sign for the rest of it, the way you use a call sign when the name is less accurate than the thing the name stands for. Midnight Watch. He wrote about what she had said outside the operations building, about decisions made before situations arrive, about knowing what you are, about the line that doesn't move. He wrote, I came into this profession believing that the most important thing in any situation was competence, the skill to execute, the training to perform under pressure. Those things matter. They matter completely. But I watched someone this night who was more than competent, and I understood something I had not understood before. Competence without character is a tool. Character with competence is a person. And in the moments when the situation goes beyond what the planning anticipated, in the moments where the math gets bad and the variables stop resolving the way you expected, and the only thing left is the gap between what you prepared and what you face in those moments, only the person matters. Only the character holds. He put the notebook in his bag. He looked out the window of the transport vehicle. He thought about what kind of person he was going to be. He thought he was still becoming it. He thought that was okay. He thought becoming is not failure. Becoming is the work. At 3:00 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late winter, Delaney filed the final operational report from the Jefferson Bridge engagement. She had been working on the supporting documentation for 3 weeks, cross-referencing the timeline, verifying the sequence of signals, incorporating Hayes' narrative account and Rhea's intelligence assessment, and the evacuation coordinator's final log. She had been thorough. She believed, accurate. The document was 31 pages, and she had read it 4 times before submitting it. On page 7, the civilian count was 67. It appeared 3 more times in the body of the report, each time 67. She submitted the report. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the signal she had received at the end of the night. 1 click, done. The brevity of it, the completeness of it, the way it had closed the night like a door pulled shut on a room that was finished, not abandoned, finished. The way things are finished when they are complete rather than just stopped. She thought about something Hayes had said to her afterward in a conversation she had not expected, and that had not appeared in any report. He had come to her desk on the morning after the debrief and sat down without preamble and said, "You authorized the artillery targeting solution." She had looked at him. "Without my order," he said. "You were on the bridge," she said. "I had command of the post." "Targeting solution only," he said, "not the shot." "Correct," she said. He had looked at her for a moment. "You were ready to take the shot." She had thought about how to answer that honestly. "I was ready to make the decision when the decision needed to be made," she said, which is different from being ready to take the shot. Hayes had nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it is different." He had paused. "You drew a line." She had looked at him. "Targeting solution without authorization," he said. "Authorization only at the moment of necessity, not before." "Yes," she said. "That's the right line," Hayes said. He had stood up and gone back to his office, and Delaney had sat at her desk for a moment afterward and thought about lines and the places where they were drawn and the people who drew them and the people who held them. She thought about all of that now, sitting in the chair after submitting the final report. She picked up the radio handset. She put it back down. She did not have anyone to call. The night was done. The document was filed. The count was right. She stood up. She put on her coat. She went to get coffee because that was the next ordinary thing, and ordinary things were how you moved from one moment to the next when the extraordinary moments were behind you and the work continued and the world kept asking. On a ridge in Montana that was unnamed on most maps, the snow was already beginning to cover the places where 6 positions had been prepared and abandoned. The 4th position, the 5th, the 6th, where a small depression in the packed snow marked the place where something had stood upright and then been taken away. The wind moved through the empty beams of the bridge's eastern approach, the only section still standing, a partial structure that led nowhere now, its purpose fulfilled and gone. The valley was quiet. The corridor that Volkov's column had needed was gone with the bridge, And the strategic situation had shifted in the ways that strategic situations shift when one critical variable changes, and none of that was visible from the ridge. What was visible from the ridge was the valley and the river and the far bank where 67 people had stood in a shelter that was warm, and the road they had taken away from it, and the ordinary morning light on the ordinary snow covering the ordinary mountains of Montana in winter. And somewhere between that ridge and a posting she would not name, in a location she would not disclose, Emily, Carter was already working. Not on this situation. This situation was finished. She had filed it in the part of her mind that held completed things not forgotten, not sealed, but settled the way things settle when they are done, and you know they are done, and the knowing is enough. She was working on the next assessment, the next profile, the next valley somewhere where the math was going to get bad and the bridge was going to matter, and someone was going to need someone to stay. She would be there, not because she had been ordered to be there, not because anyone had asked, because she was the kind of person who stayed. She had decided that a long time ago. She had never undecided it. She never would. That was the line. That was the only line that mattered. And it held. It had always held. It would hold again. Because some people make a decision about who they are before the world arrives to test it, and then they live that decision in the dark, in the cold, in the silence between the shot they could take and the one they choose not to, in the 2 seconds of attention that separate a wrong number from a right one, in the count that goes up to 67 when everyone else stopped at 63. Not for recognition, not for legend, not for the story that gets told afterward in the way all stories get larger than the truth they grew from, for the 67, always for the 67. And on the coldest nights when the storms come down from the mountains and the valleys fill with the kind of silence that has weight to it, the soldiers who know the story, the real story, not the legend, go quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of people who don't know what to say, the quiet of people who know exactly what to say and understand that saying it out loud would make it smaller than it is. So they carry it instead, the way Borov carried the cartridge, the way Mitchell carried the notebook, the way Ruth carried the morning light through the window, the way Hayes carried 67 permanent and exact and correct into every report he wrote for the rest of his career. The Midnight Watch did not end at the Jefferson Bridge. It does not end. It is not the story of one night. It is the story of the decision that precedes all nights. The decision to count. The decision to stay. The decision to hold the line between everything that is coming and the people who need someone to hold it. That decision belongs to anyone willing to make it, and the ones who make it and keep it and carry it into the dark without asking for anything back. They are the reason the count is right. They are the reason the number is 67. They are the reason on the coldest nights there is a morning.